Jon Snow gazed out across the battlefield, cold wind ripping at the edges of his heavy cloak. Snowflakes flickered through the gloom, set adrift against a sunless sky. The air tasted of ice and ashes, the bitter sting of the living's last stand. Corpses of wights lay strewn over the churned ground, though the vast majority were not so easily vanquished. They crawled and convulsed in the distance, rising anew for the Night King, an endless tide that brought no hope of victory. Atop a rise of fractured ice, the Night King himself loomed silent, his pale eyes fixed on the living below. As Jon studied the inhuman figure, an unsettling thought tugged at him, persistent as an itch he could not scratch. The old stories never spoke of the others as mindless beasts. There was a consciousness behind those piercing blue eyes, an ancient will that might be reasoned with. He did not dare hope, yet he could not help it either. Too many had died. Winterfell was close to unrecognizable, its once proud walls shattered in places, black with soot. The courtyard gates hung askew, half-burned timbers rotting like broken bones. The ditches dug outside had been turned into pits of corpses, lightless, hopeless graves for living and dead alike. And still, the endless wave of wights threatened to swamp them. The living had given everything. Daenerys had tried to burn away the hordes with dragon fire, and although it cut through thousands, still thousands more emerged from that swirling darkness. The dragons themselves were wounded. Rhaegal's flight was sluggish, and Drogon bore fresh scars from the White Walkers' spears of ice. Winter had come with a vengeance. If the dawn did not bring respite, Jon feared there would be no dawn at all. Arya stood near him, panting. Her clothes were torn, face smeared with blood and grime that only faintly masked the haunted glint in her eye. To survive this war had already demanded more from them than any living soul should ever be forced to give. In those quicksilver moments between fighting, Jon sometimes glimpsed the spark of the girl Arya once had been. Resilient, yes, but also young, full of a sharp wit and an unyielding sense of justice. Now she was a weapon honed by countless horrors, and the war threatened to break even her. Tormund Giantsbane trudged across black slush toward Jon, his huge breath plumes drifting in the frosted wind. The big man's beard was crusted with ice and blood, and sorrow etched heavy lines across his face. He jerked his head toward the chaos beyond the ruined gates. "More are coming," Tormund muttered, voice like distant thunder. "We must gather. If we linger, we'll be pulled apart." Jon took a moment before he answered, reluctant. His gaze turned back to the figure on the rise. A swirl of wind and snow obscured the Night King for a breath, and then revealed him again as if a veil had been lifted. The Night King hadn't moved, but Jon felt those deathly eyes on him, and for once he dared meet that icy regard. Something ancient, older than the wall or the White Walkers themselves, seemed to flicker in the distant starlight. "Form a defensive line near the godswood," Jon said softly. "Put those who are wounded at the crypts. No, wait, that won't save them if it comes to it. We keep them in the Great Hall. Or what's left of it. Tormund, rally everyone who can still fight." Tormund cast one wary glance to the same rise where the Night King stood. Then he slapped Jon's shoulder. "As you wish, Crow." Arya moved to Jon's side. She was breathing hard, face grim. "He's waiting," she said in a voice so low that it reminded Jon of the hush that preceded an avalanche in the mountains. "We need to do something before he sets that beastly army upon us again." Jon nodded, but his heart hammered. The question gnawed at him. How many more must die before they accepted the truth, that pure slaughter might not be the path to victory? The White Walkers might have their own end, their own reason. That single, piercing thought refused to leave him. For if the living were hopelessly outmatched, then so too might the White Walkers be subject to some threat greater than even their unrelenting fury. When he shifted his weight, the leather scabbard at his hip grazed the battered pommel of Longclaw. Ghost paced by Jon's side, battered and bleeding from tangling with undead deerwolves. The loyal albino deerwolf had refused to retreat, and Jon could almost feel the kinship of loss they shared. Everyone was exhausted, every last soul. Even Daenerys, once so poised with regal bearing, had begun to stare wide-eyed, as if the tide of darkness had finally outmatched her convictions. As John tried to step away, Arya caught his arm. He glimpsed the bright intensity in her eyes, the flicker of deep devotion that overcame all else. "John," she whispered, "tell me you have a plan." Beneath the dryness of her tone, there was desperation. She had seen too many heaped corpses, too many living turned to mindless husks in the moment of slaughter. She did not want to lose more, and neither did he. He covered her hand with his own, squeezed it gently, though neither was certain who tried to reassure whom. "We're not done fighting," John said. Then he released her, ignoring the roil in his stomach, the dread that threatened to drown him. He trudged across the courtyard, over splintered timbers and mud that had frozen into jagged ruts. The images of the dead littered his mind. Theon among them, already lost in an earlier charge, Bran with nowhere else to run, Samwell Tarly valiantly standing his ground near the wounded, and so many others. People he had known, fought alongside, died for. The knowledge choked him. This can't continue, he thought. If the dawn never comes, if all we do is kill and be killed, this is not life. This is only slaughter. Under a shattered section of battlement, Daenerys Targaryen clutched a piece of the broken stone. Her hair was loose, damp with snow, whipped about by the wind. Drogon's roar sounded somewhere beyond the castle walls, a testament to the dragon's fury, and the raw power that had once seemed unstoppable. Yet even that might have proved insufficient. Too many whites, too many White Walkers, and the Night King's terrifying command of the dead. When Daenerys heard Jon's footsteps, she lifted her gaze. Weariness carved harsh lines in her face. Her cheeks were pale. "We can't hold them back forever." She said softly, as though speaking a final confession. "Even dragonfire can't stop the endless horde. You've seen it yourself." "And now?" Jon approached quietly, hand resting on the hilt of his sword. In the swirl of light from the flaring torches, he saw the gathering tears in her eyes. Once, she had seemed invincible. Not now. "I know," he whispered, unshed tears of his own stinging. That's why. He dared to breathe, dared to speak the thought that had been spinning in his head. "I need to try something else, Dany." She scanned his face. "What can you possibly try that we haven't done already? Tell me, Jon, because I can't imagine a miracle will simply fall into our laps." "Now." He hesitated, suddenly uncertain how to give voice to the notion. "You saw how the Night King looked at me," Jon said. "It wasn't mindless. It wasn't even pure hate. There was something else. Like he expected something." Her eyebrows knit. "Expected me," Jon finished. "All of this. I think he's driven by an old purpose older than we can guess. I can't say I know what it is, but we cannot defeat them by arms alone. It's pointless." She bit her lip, expression torn. "What are you suggesting?" Jon braced himself against the ice-laden wind. "We must consider speaking with him. Parley, if that's even possible." Daenerys' laugh was a strangled thing, more a broken sound than a true scoff. "You think this demon, this abomination, would sit at a table and bargain? He's slaughtered innocents, raised them, condemned us all to darkness. What he wants is for life itself to end, and to dominate all that remains." "Perhaps," Jon said quietly. "But let me try. If it fails, I'll pay the price with my life. Maybe I can buy us time enough for you to gather what remains of your forces and protect those who can't fight." "Menawai." Daenerys looked at him, agony warring in her eyes. She remembered the times they had stood shoulder to shoulder, the trust they had built. The impossible truth of his lineage that had come between them didn't matter in this moment. Only survival mattered. "If you go to him, you will not come back," she said. "You must know that." He touched her face gently. "I cannot watch more of our people die. I already have too much blood on my hands. If there's any chance to spare lives, any chance at all, I have to do it. Now." Daenerys' lips trembled, and for a moment, she almost appeared a young girl, heartsick and overwhelmed. She closed her eyes and took a trembling breath. "I won't stop you," she whispered. "But I won't let you go alone. At least bring a guard." He shook his head. "No guard. No one else dies for me. Not for this." "Then you may be an utter fool," she whispered. "But you're still the best man I've ever known. Go, Jon Snow. As your queen, I command it." The tears gathered at the corners of her eyes, but she looked away, as though if she couldn't bear to watch him leave, she might pretend the war wouldn't devour him. Jon pressed his forehead to hers for a single heartbeat, sharing in her warmth. Then, with the biting wind in his face, he pulled away. He strode toward the gates, past the battered remains of the living who were tending the wounded or clustering in small groups for warmth. Some cast him questioning glances. Others hardly had the strength to notice. Tyrion stood near the broken portion of the outer rampart, whispering fervently with Sansa. They saw Jon pass, and the expression on Sansa's face tightened, some mixture of alarm and sorrow. Tyrion, too, looked uncertain, but neither called out. In the hush that followed, the swirling snows parted enough to reveal the bleak deathscape beyond. Shadowy shapes of whites continued to form ranks. Occasionally, one of the living archers loosed an arrow to slow the flood. The whites hissed and snapped, but for the moment, the Night King had not commanded them to surge anew. Jon left Winterfell's ramparts, stepping over the broken debris of the recent battle, mindful of the thousands of rotting eyes that watched him from beyond. Ghost followed at his heel, silent but tense. Every step was slow and deliberate. The swirling wind kicked up half-rotted leaves and ice crystals. Ahead, the Night King stood motionless on the small rise, a figure carved from the heart of the storm. Jon's breath clouded with each step. Fear bunched in his chest, no matter how he tried to calm himself. This was madness. He recalled the savage speed with which the White Walkers had attacked, the unstoppable might of the White Legions, the unstoppable way the Night King had brought Viserion back from death, turning the dragon's fire into an icy breath that had shattered the wall. That memory alone might have turned him back, but there was no returning now. Ghost let out a low whine. Jon crouched, placing a reassuring hand on his direwolf's flank. "Easy," he murmured. "Go, boy, die. Stay safe." The direwolf gave a small growl, protesting, but Jon repeated softly, "Go back." Ghost whined one more time, then reluctantly turned and padded off, glancing behind him as though to make sure Jon was certain of his choice. Jon forced himself to keep moving. At last he came close enough that the Night King's tall, spined silhouette towered above him. The pale light of the rising moon revealed every ridge of that inhuman face, the crown-like horns of ice, the ridges in his cheeks. He did not raise his arms in attack. He did not stride forward. He simply watched as Jon drew close. With a trembling breath, Jon cleared his throat. "If you can hear me," he began, voice hoarse. "If you understand me, I would speak." The hush between them was vast, broken only by the howling wind. Then, slowly, the Night King raised his eyes to meet Jon's. A swirl of the dead wind caught Jon's cloak, whipping it to one side. For a moment, Jon wondered if the Night King might vanish into a flurry of ice, or cut him down with the crackling spear of frozen crystal in his hand. Instead, the Night King tilted his head, as though in curiosity. Jon exhaled. "We cannot win," he said simply. "You have seen it. We fight, we fall, we rise again. Like you. We have used dragonfire and steel, but you still stand. You still have your legions. But what do you want?" He steadied himself. "We are not the only ones at war in this land. Beyond the south, beyond the seas, other enemies gather. Do you not see the threat of those who might end all life, all existence, even yours?" At first he sounded mad to his own ears. But he recalled the words of the three-eyed raven, the old man who'd taught Bran. There were deeper truths in the world than men could comprehend, ancient powers far beyond the petty struggles for the Iron Throne. Jon did not know precisely what might be out there beyond the edges of the known world, but he suspected the Night King did. For wasn't that what the legends said? The White Walkers had awakened for a reason. And if the living were not that reason, perhaps something darker loomed. The Night King remained silent, but not unmoving. Slowly he took a step forward. There was a rasping sound, like the whisper of dried leaves across a fresh grave. Something that might have been words, or the mere scraping of ice. But as it passed through those frozen lips, it resembled a language John did not know. John swallowed. "If you can understand me, please. There must be a different way." Even as he spoke, he realized how naive it must sound. But the truth was, he had done the unthinkable by coming here. There was only forward. He stared into the Night King's face, half expecting a lethal blow. Instead, the Night King pointed one long finger at Joan's chest. It was not a friendly gesture, more akin to a solemn pronouncement. The swirl of wind intensified, and the whites beyond them stirred, rattling their bones. John thought of the ancient promise. There must always be a Stark in Winterfell. Perhaps there was some link, some old bond. The children of the forest had created the White Walkers to protect themselves from men. A doom-laden attempt that had spun wildly out of control, so the legend said. John felt uncertain, awed, but forced himself to keep speaking. "I believe you fight for something you lost," John said, the idea crystallizing in his mind. "Something that was taken from you. If we stand together, we might." The Night King's hand shot forward, grasping Joan's forearm. It felt like plunging into a frozen lake. Joan's breath left him in a gasp, and a kaleidoscope of strange images rushed into his mind. The swirl of dark magic, the shimmer of red leaves and white bark, a towering weirwood that bled from a face carved into its trunk. He saw a figure kneeling before the tree, forging a pact, and then a swirl of centuries. A swirl of blood and frost. He saw the old ones, the children, weaving an enchantment, forging the White Walkers as guardians, only for that guardianship to turn on them when humans attacked with fire and steel. Millennia condensed into seconds. Then, as quickly as it had come, the images vanished. John reeled, nearly collapsing to his knees. He felt the heat of his own blood pounding in his ears. The Night King stood motionless again, his hand dropping to his side. John panted, breath jagged. He could still sense the whites prowling in the darkness, watchful. With trembling eyes, he looked up at the Night King once more. "You were meant to protect the land," John whispered, still reeling from the knowledge hammered into him. "To ensure no invader from the far north would breach these lands. You were created for that, turned into this, and it all went wrong." The Night King said nothing, but the silent acknowledgement seemed to hum in Joan's veins. The truth burned in John's mind, that the White Walkers were never meant to be mindless destroyers. They'd been shaped for a single purpose, but the centuries of conflict, betrayal, and the sway of dark magic had twisted that purpose into a war on life itself. Perhaps the Night King recognized that this path led only to oblivion. John inhaled, fighting through the cold seizing his limbs. "It doesn't have to end in universal death," he said. "I swear we can find a way to give you what you need. If it's war you fear from the south, the greed of men, maybe we can end that. Or at least, I can try. But not if everyone dies. Will you speak?" "Nay." The Night King did not speak, but he lifted his gaze, staring over Joan's head toward Winterfell. Then he turned, looking north, beyond the battlefield, beyond the living. In that small, subtle gesture, John sensed a question. The White Walkers had awakened, but not solely for the petty purpose of extinction. Something deeper had called them forth. Something monstrous, older than men. John thought of the watery depths of the shivering sea, the unknown wilderness of the lands of always winter. Perhaps some demonic power lingered beyond, or a threat that overshadowed even the White Walkers. "Then, unite with me," John said, the words feeling near impossible. "To save Westeros, from whatever made you, whatever is calling you back, we have to stand together." At this, the Night King inclined his head. An acknowledgement, or a prophecy? The swirl of wind quieted. The countless whites, like puppets whose strings had been slackened, wavered in place. A hush shrouded the battlefield. And in that hush, John realized with a sense of wonder that the Night King had not said no. He thought of Daenerys, of Arya, of Tormund and Sam, of all those who had survived. "Let me talk to them," Jon said, fighting to keep his voice from trembling. "Let me tell them there is a chance. No more slaughter. Not if you will hold your legion back." The Night King's frozen gaze lingered on Jon's face, and again, Jon felt the flicker of that ancient consciousness. Slowly, with a gesture that could almost be called regal, the Night King lifted his spear of ice. At once, the whites withdrew a step, forming columns that parted like a corridor around Jon Dund. Shock pulsed through him. He couldn't quite believe it. "Thank you," Jon whispered, his voice ragged. He bowed his head. Then he turned, half expecting the whites to lunge. But they did not. In a silence that felt wholly surreal, Jon walked back the way he had come, cutting through the parted ranks of the undead. By the time he reached the shattered gates, anxious faces peered out at him from the half-wrecked ramparts. Daenerys stood at the front, eyes wide. At her side hovered Arya, Sansa, Brienne, Tyrion, and a handful of the remaining lords. All had witnessed the impossible. Jon Snow walking through an entire legion of the dead, unharmed. Arya rushed forward, her boots skidding in the slush. She grabbed Jon's arm, scanning him for wounds or signs of some fell magic. "You're alive," she breathed, tension draining from her voice. "Gods, you're alive. I saw them. They parted for you." Still in disbelief himself, Jon nodded. "They're waiting." Daenerys was ashen. "How? Why? Are we about to see them rush the walls again?" For a moment, Jon could scarcely find the words. He thought of the images the Night King had shown him, the sense of anguish and inevitability. "I don't think they will," Jon said quietly. "Not unless we give them cause." Tyrion stepped closer, scanning Jon's face with piercing curiosity. "So, you did the unthinkable and reasoned with a being that everyone considered beyond reason." "It seemed so," Jon answered. "But we are far from safe. This is a tenuous peace, if it can be called that. I saw ancient memories. I suspect the Night King awakens only when another horror is brewing in the far north. Something that might threaten not only men, but the White Walkers as well. He sees men as destroyers who would never willingly ally with them. Perhaps that's partly why he marched south, to conquer or destroy what he believed would inevitably be an enemy. I can't claim to know all of it, only that he's no mindless monster." "Then?" Sansa stepped forward, a taut line in her brow, her face streaked with blood and soot. "So what happens now? You propose we ally with this creature?" Jon met her gaze. "It's not a choice we make lightly. But we cannot defeat them militarily. And from what I glimpsed, neither can they truly defeat us without risking something else, something that might be a threat to them too. If we unite, perhaps we can confront that greater threat together." "Now." For a moment, the courtyard fell silent, except for the moans of the wounded and the whisper of wind through the shattered towers. Faces of lords and soldiers reflected shock, disbelief, and fear. "I've seen your willingness to make peace," Daenerys said quietly. "But forging peace with the dead is beyond imagining." Jon closed his eyes. "No, but I know that if we continue this war, it ends with all of us in graves, resurrected only to kill our own. I will not be part of that horror anymore." "Da." Daenerys studied him. The flicker of old determination sparked in her expression. "Then I will stand by you," she said. "Though it goes against every instinct in me, every vow I made to protect the living from the dead. I have to trust you." He inclined his head gratefully. Sansa stared at him a moment longer, then exhaled. "What must we do?" Jon managed a shaky breath. "We must approach the Night King with honesty. We must treat with him the way we would treat with any army. Come to terms, define a common goal, and, gods help us, agree to fight side by side." "Nawanda." The incredulous hush in the courtyard yielded to a sudden uproar. Some of the men cried out in horror, brandishing their weapons, protesting that they would never fight alongside the abominations. Others stared in exhausted silence, seeing no other path. Tyrion, brow creased in thought, raised a hand to calm them. "Stop," he said, voice urgent. "Listen to Lord Snow. None of you can deny what you've seen. There is no victory here if we keep to our old ways." Then shall. Bit by bit, the outrage quieted. Jon lowered his voice. "We have lost so many. Let us not lose more. If there is a path for peace, we must try." He expected chaos, more arguments. Instead, it was Brienne of Tarth who stepped forth. She looked battered, her armor dented, a long cut above her temple scabbed with frost. "I sworn to uphold the realms of men," she said, voice resolute. "But what does that oath mean if there are no men left to protect? My sword is yours, Jon Snow. Let us see what can be done." Sansa inhaled, pressed her lips together. She looked almost ill, but she nodded. "If we can save the North, I will do what must be done." She glanced at Arya, who did not speak, only nodded her agreement. Tormund Giantsbane bellowed, "Strangest damned thing I've ever heard. But if Jon Snow says we can keep our heads by forging peace with these cracked ice bastards, I'll hold my axe until I know otherwise." One by one the wounded and the weary bowed their heads, gave nods of acquiescence. They were battered beyond measure. If there was the faintest glimmer of hope, that was all they had left. "Then gather the lords," Jon said. "We need a proper meeting with the Night King, or whatever manner of discussion we can achieve." He turned a wry, anxious look on Tyrion. "We may need your silver tongue." Tyrion's mouth twitched into a humorless smile. "I've outtalked lords, queens, and sellswords. The dead might be a new test, but I'll try." He inclined his head. "Gods be good. Let's live to see what tomorrow brings." So it came to pass that the battered survivors in Winterfell prepared for a most unlikely assembly. They designated the godswood as neutral ground, with the heart tree as witness. The godswood was half burned, its ancient weirwood trunk scarred by the battles that had raged around it. But it still stood as a testament to old powers. Maybe, Jon thought, if any place in Winterfell still held ancient magic, it was there. It might help keep the tenuous peace. Though the night was black as pitch, a thick ring of torches and bonfires were erected around the clearing, providing a halo of flickering light that reflected on the red leaves of the weirwood. A hush draped itself over the castle walls. The living who were not needed for guard or watch huddled in the great hall, or else peered anxiously from the ramparts. Every man and woman able to bear a weapon held it ready, just in case the dead betrayed them. A small group ventured into the godswood. Jon Snow, Daenerys Targaryen, Tyrion Lannister, Sansa Stark, Arya Stark, Tormund Giantsbane, and a handful of others. Brienne stood behind Sansa, watchful. Grey Worm, his face etched with distrust, positioned himself near Daenerys with a bare blade stance. They gathered by the heart tree, their breath visible in the cold. Torches threw shadows that danced among the ancient branches. The snow had slowed to a fine dusting, swirling in a faint breeze. The hush was so profound that when the next presence arrived, every faint crunch of ice felt like a thunderclap. From out of the gloom stepped the White Walkers. They advanced slowly, impossibly graceful, on the frozen ground. Their outlines seemed to blur at the edges, as if they were illusions conjured from the gloom. The Whites trailed behind them, an army of silent watchers, stopping at the edge of the torchlight. At the center of the group came the Night King, spear of ice in hand, clad in that strange, spiky armor. He moved like a regal phantom, and for a moment, even the fierce hearts of Tormund and Grey Worm quailed. The White Walkers fanned out, forming a circle that mirrored the living. Tension snapped in the air. Jon saw the swirl of fear and determination on Daenerys' face, and felt his own heart pounding so loudly it drowned out everything else. He forced himself forward, bridging the gap between the living and the dead. He stopped an arm's length from the Night King. "We gather to end this war," Jon said. His voice sounded hollow in the quiet. "We gather for peace, for an alliance. If you can show us that you stand ready, we will stand with you. The living have foes beyond these walls, and so do you. We want to end the slaughter. We want to help." The Night King remained silent. Then, softly, he tilted his head at the weirwood tree. One of the other White Walkers, an ancient-looking figure with a crown of broken ice horns, stepped forward. He rasped something in that unknown language, a series of breathy clicks and hisses that made the torch flames flicker. Jon could not understand it. Tyrion cleared his throat. "I've studied many tongues, yet this is beyond me." Suddenly, the Night King drew closer to the heart tree. Raising one pale hand, he touched the carved face in the trunk. The moment his fingertips made contact, the red leaves rustled with a sound like sighing ghosts. A swirl of wind ruffled everyone's clothing. Tendrils of ice began crawling along the bark from the place where the Night King's fingertips made contact, until the weirwood's face was half covered in frost. Bran Stark emerged from the darkness. No one had seen him approach. He was simply there, his wheelchair guided by Podrick. His expression was distant, as if he was half in another place. "He speaks through the tree," Bran said, voice echoing strangely. "I can sense him. He says that men always break their pacts. That once, men and the children of the forest created the White Walkers to defend against unspeakable horrors. But men turned upon them, driving them into shadow." "How?" Sansa's eyes widened. "Bran, how?" Bran's gaze was fixed somewhere beyond the here and now. "He asks if we will betray them again," Bran continued in a measured tone. "He speaks of the Great Other, an enemy older than men, older than the first long night. The Night King says that the doom that stirs beyond the edge of the world dwarfs any hatred he holds for mankind. But he cannot face it alone. He demands a sacrifice of trust." They see. The tension in the air ratcheted tighter. Jon looked back at Daenerys, Tyrion, Sansa, each of them wearing expressions that ranged from curiosity to dread. Jon returned his attention to Bran. "What kind of sacrifice?" Bran's eyes fluttered, as though seeing more than was physically present. "He says that for men to accept the White Walkers as allies, a blood bond must be forged. Ancient magic demands an exchange. One from each side must cross into the other's domain, so that neither can strike without destroying what they hold dear." "Meant." At those words, murmurs spread among the living. Grey Worm bristled, face grim. Tormund looked uneasy, gripping his axe. Daenerys' eyes flashed. "We're supposed to hand one of our own to these creatures?" she demanded, outraged. "No, that's not." Jon raised a hand. "Wait. Hear it out." Bran's voice remained steady, though a note of empathy crept in. "He also says that one of their own will come among us willingly, so that if the Night King betrays the pact, we will have them as a hostage. Likewise, one of us must live among the White Walkers until the threat beyond the north is ended. An exchange of hostages." The hush returned, heavier than before. Tyrion's brow furrowed. "This is some archaic tradition, no doubt. Hostages exchanged for peace. But to ask one of the living to reside with the dead, is that even possible?" Bran inclined his head, listening to what only he could perceive. "He says it's possible, if the living one is protected by an enchantment, a sliver of the White Walker's power to ensure survival in the cold lands, a brand upon the flesh that will allow them to walk among the others safely." Bran's eyes found Jon's. "But they will not be the same after." The group fell silent. Jon swallowed. A part of him had known it would come to something like this. A test of will, a sacrifice for peace. He took a step forward, meeting the Night King's gaze. "I will go," he said, voice quiet but resolute. Arya's protest was immediate. "No. Jon, you can't. You already risked yourself once. That's someone else." "I'm king in the north," Jon said. Though the words felt heavy on his tongue, given all the confusion over titles. "Or rather, I was. If the White Walkers need a Stark to seal this pact, it should be me. Besides," he paused, scanning the faces of the others. "The Night King and I, we share a connection. The visions, the sense that this was fated. If there's anyone who can stand among them and not be lost, it's me." Daenerys stepped forward, eyes shining with fierce determination. If you go, who will lead our forces? Who will lead the living? We need you here. Tormund grunted. She's not wrong. You're the glue that keeps us from falling apart. If you leave, what becomes of the living's resolve? Jon looked at Daenerys, at Sansa, at Arya, at Tormund and Tyrion, all the friends and allies who'd bled with him. He loved them all, in his own quiet, solemn way. A pang of sorrow clutched at his heart. We have no choice, he said. If we truly want peace, we must give something. I have always given my life to protect the realm. This is the same, only in a different shape. Daenerys, you are a queen. You have dragons. You have leadership. You can carry on. And Sansa can lead the north with Arya and Bran by her side. Tyrion can advise. Tormund can watch over the free folk. All of you can do this together. You don't need me here for that. Then? Sansa's eyes glistened. Jon, I know we stand on the precipice of extinction, but please, think if there is another way. He gave her a tight, sad smile. I have. This is the only way I see. The hush felt absolute. Even the Night King and his White Walkers stood motionless, as if waiting to see if the living would indeed agree to the price. Then, in the quiet, another voice spoke up. I'll volunteer, came a whisper. It was the Hound, stepping from the shadows with a grimace. I hate your talk of peace with these ice shits, but if it spares us another bloody fight, I'll go. Jon shook his head softly. Thank you, Sandor. But it has to be me. I've already forged a kind of bridge with the Night King. The Hound narrowed his eyes but said no more. At last, Daenerys exhaled, shoulders sagging. The devastation in her face was raw. She looked like she wanted to protest anew, to order him not to do it, but she said nothing. She remembered how he had once bent the knee to her for the sake of the living, a quiet admission that duty must come before all else. She would not stop him now. Tyrion cleared his throat, forcibly injecting a note of clarity. Then we must settle the details. If you go to them, one of the White Walkers must remain here as hostage. With an almost imperceptible nod, the Night King reached out. Another White Walker, this one with a slender build and an intricately carved staff of ice, stepped forward. There was an air of reluctance about them, but they bowed their head to the Night King. Jon turned toward Bran. Tell him we accept. Bran's eyes fluttered again, lost in that half-sight. The wind sighed, stirring the leaves. It is done, Bran said. Tomorrow, as the first pale light touches the sky, the exchange shall be made. With that pronouncement, the Night King drew back his hand from the heart tree. The frost that clung to the bark melted slowly, though the weirwood's surface had been scored by cracks. The White Walkers turned and filed out of the godswood, the silent whites parting to let them pass. A swirl of wind followed, then the undead army vanished into the darkness. Jon felt every muscle shaking. He could barely believe it had happened. They had negotiated an armistice with the White Walkers, made an arrangement so radical, it still hadn't properly settled in his mind. He sank to his knees, feeling the cold ground seep into his bones, as though the Night King's touch still lingered. Daenerys knelt at his side, her hand on his shoulder. We have tonight, she whispered, voice thick with emotion. Before dawn claims you for the dead. The words shattered something inside him. He placed a hand over hers, and for an instant, their eyes met, brimming with regrets unspoken. There was no time for tears. They had to prepare for what was to come, but that night, for the first time in what felt like eternity, the living did not fight the dead. Instead, they found a restless sleep, or tried to, awaiting the dawn's uncertain promise. At first light, the hush of the battlefield felt strangely hopeful, as though the very air had shifted. Surviving soldiers mustered behind the gates of Winterfell, each uncertain if the White Walkers would reappear with peaceful intentions or with wrath. But they saw no sign of them, only that swirl of pale snow across the churned mud. Inside the godswood, a small assembly gathered once more. Jon, Daenerys, Tyrion, Sansa, Arya, Tormund, Brienne, Grey Worm, Bran, and a handful of others. They were joined by the White Walker chosen to remain as hostage, the slender being clad in shimmering frost armor, standing unnervingly still at the edge of the clearing. The White Walker's presence prickled at everyone's nape, but it made no move to harm them, only observe. Bran exhaled, his breath curling in the cold. "He's near," Bran murmured. "I can feel him." A moment later, a swirl of unnatural wind parted the trees. The Night King stepped into the godswood, his tall form as regal and terrifying as ever. Behind him came two other White Walkers bearing a small chest, carved of what appeared to be weirwood, and bound with creeping vines of ice. They set it down upon the snow without a word. Jon's heart pounded. The agreement was that the Night King would mark him with some enchantment, so he might endure the frozen north in the White Walker's realm. Jon squared his shoulders. "I am ready." Nearby, Daenerys clenched her fists until the knuckles turned white. Sansa stood stiff, arms folded, face set in stony resolve. Arya's expression was unreadable, but her eyes glistened. Tyrion shifted from foot to foot. Tormund's lips were pressed into a thin line. The White Walkers opened the chest. Inside lay a small crystalline dagger, carved from purest ice. Its surface shimmered in the weak morning light, and the edges pulsed faintly with an otherworldly power. A hush ran through the living. Bran's voice wavered. "He means to cut your palm and let a single drop of your blood mix with the ice. That will bind you to their realm. You will gain a fraction of their cold. You will not freeze amid the harsh storms, nor will you become one of the Whites. But it changes you. Be warned." Then Jon swallowed. "I understand." The Night King's eyes fixed on Jon. Then he gestured for Jon to extend his hand over the chest. Jon exhaled and did so. Tormund let out a strangled noise of protest, but did not interfere. The Night King lifted the ice dagger, pressed the tip against Jon's palm. An unearthly chill radiated from the blade, making Jon's entire arm numb. Then, with a single swift motion, the Night King drew it across Jon's skin. It cut so easily, with no pain at first, but a split second later, Jon felt the cold bite deepen into a burning ache. A bead of crimson welled up in his palm. The Night King caught it on the dagger's frosty surface. The blood sizzled, turning a crackling black around the edges where it touched the enchanted ice. Jon clenched his jaw, refusing to cry out. The Night King moved the dagger over the chest, letting the blackened droplet trickle into a small hollow within the crystal. As it touched the frosty interior, a swirl of vapor burst forth, a mingling of red mist and white steam. Jon's vision blurred. He swayed as a sudden wave of freezing cold rushed up his arm and through his veins, as though the blood in his body had turned to shards of ice. He might have fallen if Daenerys and Arya hadn't rushed forward to brace him. Jon's breath came in ragged bursts. He felt his heart stuttering, fighting to keep pumping. His eyes locked with Daenerys, who whispered his name, voice trembling. Then, as quickly as it had come, the surge of cold receded. Jon regained enough control to stand, though he felt different. The biting cold of the morning no longer stung his skin. The frost-laden wind seemed almost comforting, as if he belonged to it. Where the knife had cut him, the wound sealed with a faint sheen of ice, leaving a pale, cold scar. Bran spoke in a hush. "The bond is formed." The Night King placed the dagger back into the chest, stepped forward, and extended an open palm to Jon as if to shake his hand. Jon's gaze flicked to the Night King's face. Then he raised his own hand, now unblemished save for that frosty scar, and clasped the Night King's. The grip was cold, yes, but not the deathly chill of before. It felt almost natural. Tyrion released a tense breath. "So, we have our arrangement." Sansa, Arya, and Daenerys hovered close. They knew that by taking this vow, Jon had essentially sworn to travel north with the White Walkers. A question still hung in the air. Would the White Walkers truly retreat from the living lands? Would they truly allow the living to exist unharmed? As if in silent answer, the Night King turned his head toward the east, where the light was growing. With a subtle wave of his arm, a gust of wind ruffled the trees. Far beyond the godswood, they heard the shifting of countless bodies. Whites. The Legion was leaving, returning north. The White Walker, chosen as hostage, stood near Sansa, an unmoving pillar of ice in the swirling flakes of snow. Jon turned to his companions. He felt a swirl of emotion so intense it threatened to undo him. "It's time," he said hoarsely. "I'll leave with them now, so none suspect we plan treachery." Daenerys parted her lips, the beginnings of an argument forming. But she saw the resolute finality in Jon's eyes and closed her mouth again, tears brimming. There was nothing more to say. She nodded, stepping closer. Before all assembled, she gently pressed her lips to his, a kiss laden with the heartbreak of farewell. A hush fell over the watchers. Even Grey Worm and Tyrion turned their gazes aside, giving them a moment of privacy in the open air. Arya's eyes misted. She caught Jon's sleeve. "Be safe, you stupid, noble fool," she whispered. She would have said more, but her voice caught. Sansa managed a tight nod, her own tears silent. Tormund clasped Jon in a bear-like hug, muttering, "You come back, or I'll march my free folk up there to drag you home." Jon mustered a weak, grateful smile. "Thank you, friend." Then, with a final look at those he loved, Jon moved to the Night King's side. The White Walkers turned as one, gliding away. Jon followed, stepping beyond the ring of torches and into the swirling dark. He did not look back again. In that moment, he wondered if he would ever see Winterfell again. Yet the cold that now flowed through his veins emboldened him. Somehow, he believed that this was not the end of hope, but its rebirth in a new and terrifying form. Behind them, the living watched, hearts weighed down by sorrow and an odd, flickering seed of hope. The White Walkers had departed, the battle had ceased, and for the first time in what felt like centuries, the living were granted a reprieve from death's onslaught. But the price was steep, and they all feared what unknowns lay beyond the horizon. Days stretched into weeks. The living busied themselves with the unthinkable task of rebuilding Winterfell, burying, sometimes burning, the dead, salting the land so whites would not rise again, and forging a fragile sense of normalcy. The White Walker hostage dwelled in a chamber near the Great Keep, seldom speaking, if it could speak at all, and seeming content to stand motionless for hours upon hours. Some of the living glared at it in hatred, remembering lost friends. Others avoided it in fear. But, as the pact demanded, they did it no harm. Sansa resumed governance of the North, with Tyrion offering counsel. Daenerys spent her hours rallying the remains of her Unsullied and the Dothraki who survived, forging a new shape for her rule, uncertain of what the future held. She insisted upon nightly vigils, eyes scanning the skies, as though half expecting Jon to return astride some undead dragon or leading an army of whites. But nothing stirred from the north. Winter's grip tightened. Howling winds and fierce blizzards hemming them in. Occasionally, a raven arrived from the south, where Cersei's forces wondered if the threat had truly passed. The White Walkers had vanished from the southern vantage, as if they had never existed. But the north knew better. Each day, Arya visited Bran beneath the heart tree, where they sat in quiet conversation. Arya often found him gazing into the distance, eyes hazy, searching for signs of Jon in the endless tapestry of greensight. But the swirling storms of the far north clouded Bran's vision. He caught only glimpses, a silhouette on a frozen plain, figures of ice crossing vast glaciers, fleeting echoes of shapes that might not be wholly human. Once, Bran whispered that he sensed a monstrous presence at the edges of the world, something older than the White Walkers. Arya's heart hammered at the thought. She pressed him for details, but he could offer little more. Meanwhile, beyond the wall and the mountainous wilds, Jon Snow traveled with the White Walkers deeper into the domain of eternal night. He felt the numbness in his hands and feet fade away, replaced by a cold that no longer harmed but sustained him. He needed little food and less water. Sleep drifted in and out of him, like swirling snowdrifts, replaced by a strange meditative state. At times, he conversed with the Night King, not in spoken words, but in flickers of memory and sensation. They were building an uneasy understanding. He came to see that among the White Walkers there was a hierarchy, a silent dance of authority with the Night King at its apex. Though they rarely spoke in any tongue he understood, he sensed them communicating in glances, in subtle shifts of posture, in the faint resonance of magic in the air. He saw them gather around half-buried obelisks carved from black ice, remnants of times older than men's histories, and gleaned from the images that these obelisks once served as wards against a malignant force. Ward stones, perhaps. But many had been shattered or lost to the snows. As they journeyed, the Night King showed John sweeping visions of the savage north. Giants roamed these wastes, twisted by the biting cold, rarely glimpsed by men. There were ruins of ancient strongholds, built by the children of the forest or older races yet unknown. Flickers of a shadow that stirred beneath the ice, devouring anything that dared approach. The Great Other, some might call it. Or simply a primal darkness that had slumbered for eons. John felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold. This was the foe that had prompted the White Walkers' re-emergence. They had marched south to claim an army of the dead, to strengthen themselves for the coming clash. And men, in their ignorance, would have become casualties in that cosmic war. Now, though, an alternative existed. Men might help. Perhaps living dragons, living steel, living cunning would tip the scales. One frigid evening, if evening, it could be called under a perpetual sky of swirling gray, the Night King halted the march at the mouth of a glacier-choked valley. Cyclopean ice towers loomed on either side, glittering in starlight. The wind shrieked. The White Walkers stared ahead in silent unity. John stepped forward, following their gaze. At the far end of the valley, the ice had fractured, forming a colossal sinkhole. The faint glimmer of unnatural phosphorescent light emanated from below, flickering with a pulsing rhythm like a beast's slow heartbeat. Even from a distance, John felt an undercurrent of dread tugging at him. The Night King turned to John, lifting a hand. John felt, rather than heard, the voice, a warning. This was the lair of the Great Other, or its threshold. The swirling energies here were enough to kill any mortal. John braced himself, feeling the brand on his palm tingle. He swallowed. "We cannot face it alone," John said, his words vanishing into the icy wind. But the Night King seemed to understand the sentiment. He turned, gestured to his retinue. They began to form ranks, as though preparing for war. Despite the centuries of existence that had shaped them into deathly beings, John sensed unease among them. This was a foe that even the White Walkers feared. John's breath plumed. "We need the living," he whispered, feeling that truth in the pit of his stomach. "My people, my friends, they can help. We have dragons, Valyrian steel, the combined might of all 7 kingdoms. We must call them north before it's too late." Nesh. The Night King's gaze pinned John. There was a silent question in it. Could men truly be trusted to come here, to fight the Great Other in the heart of the White Walkers' domain? Would they answer that call, or would they use the opportunity to destroy the White Walkers from behind? John's eyes burned. "I gave my life to form this pact," he said. "I trust them. We must let them prove themselves. If we do not, we all die." Then, the Night King turned away, focusing again on the distant sinkhole. For a long, silent minute, the wind whipped around them, swirling flurries and shards of ice. Then, with a regal turn, the Night King pointed south. A single White Walker, tall and lean, broke from the group. He approached John, carrying a chunk of obsidian or black ice inscribed with alien runes. In a swirl of frosty light, the object glowed. John felt a crackling jolt in his chest, as though the brand on his palm were resonating with it. In a silent flash of understanding, John realized they were giving him a means to contact the living, a method to call them north. The White Walkers could conjure illusions across great distances, as the Night King had done in visions before. This shard might allow John to send a message. But would the living answer? He closed his eyes, letting the cold swirl around him. "Yes," he whispered. "I will call them, and I pray they come." Far away, in Winterfell's courtyard, Sansa and Arya found themselves called to an urgent meeting in the godswood. Bran was there, pale and trembling in his chair. He clutched the trunk of the weirwood with one hand. The White Walker hostage lingered at the edge of the clearing, silent as ever, but as they watched, that glacial being quivered, as though reacting to some unseen force. Arya approached Bran swiftly, placing a hand on his shoulder. "Bran, what's wrong?" His eyes were open wide. "Jon is sending a message," Bran rasped, voice edged with an otherworldly echo. "I can feel it through the Weirwood network. The White Walker here is the conduit." Sansa swallowed hard. "Jon, he's alive. Then what is the message?" "Benabal." Bran's expression twisted, as if in pain. "He says, the Night King demands the living march north. A force large enough to fight the darkness that stirs beyond the Frostfangs. Some ancient evil rouses. Something that dwarfs our comprehension. If we do not unite, if we do not come, all will be lost." Arya's eyes sparked with a mixture of fear and fierce resolve. "We have to go to him. I won't let him face this alone." Sansa tensed. All the living must unite. That would mean rallying every lord of Westeros, asking them to march beyond the wall into the darkest heart of winter. That is a tall order. The realm is fractured. Cersei still sits on the Iron Throne in King's Landing, no doubt refusing to believe the threat remains. We have no guarantee of the Southern Lord's cooperation. Then, a rustling from behind them signaled Daenerys's approach. She'd heard enough. Her eyes blazed with renewed determination. "Then we make them understand. We do not have the luxury of doubt. The time for pettiness is over. Let them see our armies, our dragons. Let them hear the White Walker hostage speak, or see it at least, if it cannot speak. They must unite, or all is lost." "Now," Sansa regarded her with a level stare. "You think we can make them?" "Cersei will spout her lies, or stall, or look for advantage. We hardly have the resources to fight a war on two fronts, against both the Great Other and Cersei's armies." Tyrion joined them then, accompanied by a small retinue of guards who observed the White Walker hostage nervously. "Perhaps we don't need to fight her," Tyrion said slowly. "We simply need to persuade her that if she does not help, she will die. Even Cersei can be forced to see reason if the threat is dire enough. At the very least, she might grudgingly allow us to go about saving the world while she sits in her city and waits to see who survives." Arya's lips curled in distaste. "One day, I'll kill her. But I suppose I can wait until after the end of the world is averted." Bran spoke again, voice taking on that strange resonance. "Jon says that we must not delay. The darkness grows by the day, gaining strength. The White Walkers cannot hold it back alone for long." He shuddered, releasing his grip on the weirwood trunk. "We have to rally. We must go." A hush fell as the gravity of the moment soaked in. "Then rally we shall," Daenerys declared. "We will march south first, gather every ally we can, and then lead them north beyond the wall to face this new threat. The White Walker here," she gestured to the silent figure, "is our proof. Let any lord who doubts see it with their own eyes." Sansa nodded firmly. "We will call our banners, send ravens to the Eyrie, River Run, Storm's End, the Vale, the Reach, any place that still has men and arms to spare. Tyrion, we must contact your brother." "Jaime," Tyrion said, a flicker of sadness passing through his eyes. "He's parted ways with Cersei, last I heard. He may join us, but let us not linger on that too long. The essential point is speed." Brienne stepped forward. "We must send riders at once. If the lords do not heed our ravens, we must show them your dragons. Some will remain mistrustful, but I will do my best to sway those who remember the name Stark." "Dah." Daenerys exhaled, glancing toward the sky. Drogon and Rhaegal circled overhead, their cries echoing across the snows. She prayed they were strong enough to endure another war, this time against an enemy more monstrous than even the White Walkers had been to the living. "We do it," she said. "We do it for Jon. We do it for us all." So began a feverish flurry of preparations. Messages were sent across the realm. The White Walker hostage stood as silent witness, occasionally stirring as if restless. Word spread like wildfire. The dead had retreated, but the king in the north had given himself over to them. Now, some new, unimaginable horror. Threatened from the frozen wastes, and all living souls were asked, no, commanded, to unite under the banner of Daenerys Targaryen and the Stark leadership of the North. In King's Landing, Cersei read the missive with a sneer, spitting curses about traitors and dead men. Yet even she had heard the rumors of the unstoppable White Walker tide. She might not have believed it before, but after having lost many Lannister soldiers in a prior skirmish and hearing rumors from her own scouts, she could not dismiss it outright. Qyburn whispered in her ear of dark powers, secrets gleaned from the realm of necromancy. He suggested that if the living did indeed march north, they would be weakened, leaving the south vulnerable for her own schemes. Cersei weighed her options and decided to let them gather, while she conserved her forces behind the walls of King's Landing. Perhaps the Great Other would devour them all, leaving her unopposed. But if the threat proved genuine, she might find herself forced to act, if only to ensure her own survival. And so, from the Stormlands, the Reach, the Vale, and even scattered enclaves of Dorne, men and women began the march north. Fear permeated every step, but the call had gone out, and enough lords and knights remembered the horrors that had nearly taken the world. They chose to heed the summons. So an army began to assemble around Winterfell, thousands of them, forging an uneasy alliance of houses that had not stood together in living memory. Weeks rolled into a month. Supplies were gathered, horses readied. Daenerys directed the drilling of the new recruits, forging them into a single fighting force. She flew overhead with Drogon, ensuring that no house banners shirked their duty. The White Walker hostage became an unsettling fixture in the courtyard, a living, or unliving, reminder of what they now faced. Sometimes, lords tried to speak to it, to no avail. But its mere presence lent credibility to the proclamations of doom that Tyrion and Sansa delivered. All the while, the snows deepened. The cold burned, an unrelenting reminder of the new long night creeping ever southward. Yet, beneath the hush of that endless winter, a spark of hope persisted. They would not let Jon stand alone. Not this time. In the far north, Jon could feel changes stirring in his own body. The brand the Night King had placed upon him granted him resistance to the cold, the ability to walk through blizzards without freezing, to sense the icy resonance of the White Walker's silent speech. He discovered that his hair, always dark, now had thin streaks of white at the temples. His eyes, once brown as a Stark's, took on flecks of icy blue in certain lights. At times he looked at his hands and barely recognized them, for they did not tremble in the cold, nor did they bear the usual signs of living flesh. He remained alive, possessed of a beating heart, but he existed in a liminal space between living and dead. Some nights, the Night King beckoned him to silent gatherings where White Walkers performed rituals at ancient altars of ice. They carved runes into the snow, chanting in whispers that crackled like brittle leaves. They were forging wards, fueling illusions, fortifying themselves for the coming battle. Despite the language barrier, Jon understood enough. The Great Other's power was rising beneath that sinkhole, yearning to break free, to sweep the world in an endless void. Unless they found a way to seal it once more, or destroy it outright, everything they knew would be devoured. Jon prayed his message had reached Bran, that Daenerys and Sansa would rally the realm. He prayed men would come, that they would not let old rivalries overshadow the new threat. The White Walkers had bound themselves to him in trust, but that trust could shatter if the living betrayed it, and then all would be lost. From a high vantage point on an icy cliff, Jon gazed down upon the swirling storms that enshrouded the entire region. Through the mist, he spotted a swarm of figures on a distant ridge. It was the Night King's vanguard, patrolling the boundaries, ensuring that no monstrous creatures slipped by. They were arrayed like phantoms, their eyes gleaming in the perpetual twilight. As he stood there, a memory of Winterfell's courtyard flickered in his mind, of smiling faces, warm fires, the sound of children laughing. It felt like a dream from another life. He wondered if he would ever feel the warmth of a southern sun again, or if he would remain a frost-bound sentinel, never truly belonging to the living or the dead. But then he gritted his teeth. No, he would see them again. Daenerys, Sansa, Arya. He would see them, or die, in the attempt to save this world. And so, time edged onward, the stage set for a confrontation that would transcend all wars of men, all wars of the dead. The living armies readied themselves to march beyond the wall, guided by a queen of dragons and the Starks of Winterfell, forging alliances once unimaginable. Ahead, in the heart of that frozen realm, Jon Snow stood beside the Night King, bound by a pact of blood and ice, prepared to stand as a shield against the Great Other. If they failed, darkness would consume not just the North, not just Westeros, but the entire world. No living soul truly grasped the magnitude of what lay ahead, but they pressed on nonetheless, hearts filled with a desperate resolve. In that uncertain gloom, a single truth shone as bright as any star. For the first time in history, Jon Snow and the Night King stood on the same side, forging an unholy union to save everything that drew breath. The final, decisive battle hovered on the horizon, a promise of cataclysm, and perhaps, if the gods were merciful, renewal. Only time would tell if life could endure such a trial, or if all would fall into the endless dark. The days in Winterfell blended together in a haze of wintry preparation and uneasy alliances. With the threat of the Great Other looming in the far north, each passing moment felt like a whisper of urgency. Soldiers from every corner of the Seven Kingdoms filtered into the castle grounds, or gathered in makeshift encampments outside its walls. The once sparse yard teemed with men and women wearing a patchwork of house sigils, stags, roses, falcons, sunbursts, krakens, and lions. Some had marched for weeks, braving snow-choked roads, half-frozen rivers, and the hazards that came with such a difficult journey north. Still, they came. The memory of the near-apocalyptic war with the White Walkers, and the dread rumor that something far worse stirred beyond the wall, pushed them onward. Daenerys, though still racked by a fierce sense of loss and worry over Jon's absence, stood at the head of these gatherings with her chin high, determined to keep the coalition focused. The North still looked to Sansa Stark for leadership, especially in daily matters of supply and distribution, while Daenerys oversaw the broader strategy. Her dragons, Drogon and Rhaegal, became a spectacle that lords and knights could not ignore. At least once a day, Daenerys soared overhead on Drogon's back, reminding any faint-hearted allies of the power that stood behind her. Rhaegal, though more subdued, took to flying short scouting runs along the White Knife, and beyond, ensuring that no pockets of straggling whites or stray bandits threatened their rear. Winterfell's Great Hall became a central command post. Its roof bore fresh scars from the recent battles. Repairs were underway, though the bitter cold slowed the carpenters' and blacksmiths' labors. They lit large fires in the hearths to keep the space livable, cramming the hall with tables, maps, and scribes, who penned endless messages to distant lords. Tyrion paced among them, ever watchful, stepping in to offer advice or sly persuasion whenever disputes threatened to boil over. Some lords questioned the presence of the silent White Walker that had taken up residence in a disused corridor near the Maester's tower. This creature, a hostage according to the pact, seemed neither hostile nor particularly interested in men's affairs. It moved with languid grace, always silent, responding only to certain cues from Bran or from the heart tree in the godswood. At times it simply vanished, reappearing hours later without explanation. Most found its presence unnerving. But whenever a new lord or knight arrived with doubts about the rumored alliance, Tyrion and Sansa would lead them to observe the White Walker. That glimpse of an other in living flesh was enough to eliminate arguments that the threat had been exaggerated. Those first few weeks of uncertain truce saw small pockets of violence, anxious sellswords, or uneasy knights who couldn't bear the idea of an undead creature in their midst tried to ambush the White Walker. They were invariably stopped by a combination of vigilant guards, and in one instance, the White Walker's own reflexes. A single slash of its icy staff disarmed a would-be attacker in an instant, but it did not kill him. Instead, it stepped back, posture eerily tranquil, as though to say, "I will not break the pact unless you force me." Word spread of that incident, quashing further attempts. Amid the tension, Arya patrolled the halls of Winterfell with silent determination. She had grown adept at slipping into shadows, gleaning whispers of discontent among the newly arrived soldiers. Many remembered the War of the Five Kings all too vividly. Old feuds still simmered. Some knights from the Westerlands eyed the northern clansmen with distrust. Some of the southern lords bristled at fighting under Daenerys Targaryen, whom they had scarcely recognized as queen. The memories of madness in House Targaryen's past lingered. Still, fear of the unknown horror that lurked beyond the wall bound them more tightly than any oath. In those weeks, Sansa rarely found rest. The labyrinth of supply lines, rationing, housing for thousands of new arrivals, and negotiations with each house's representatives demanded her constant attention. She held daily audiences in the library tower or the great hall, consulting with maesters and stewards. More than once she looked up from a heap of parchments to see Tyrion's sympathetic half-smile. The two shared an odd camaraderie that bridged their complicated past. While the realm remembered them as an awkwardly matched pair once forcibly wed, time had twisted them into something resembling genuine respect, perhaps friendship. Late in the evenings, she often sought his counsel, and he always reminded her that no matter how daunting the chaos, she handled it better than most kings or queens he had served. Brienne and Podrick oversaw the training of newcomers. The practice yard rang with the clang of steel on steel from dawn to dusk. Knights of the Vale drilled side by side with hedge knights from the Crownlands, while soldiers from the Riverlands locked shields with unsullied veterans who had survived the long night. The Dothraki riders, fewer now than before, galloped across the fields outside Winterfell's walls, whooping and shouting war cries that rattled the more traditional lords. Yet, beneath the tension, there was a slow blossoming of mutual respect. They were united by necessity, forging a unique brotherhood that might not last after the war. But in this moment, it felt potent. One day, amid the flurry of preparations, Brienne was walking the battlements with Jaime Lannister. He had arrived weeks before, with a small retinue of men loyal to him, rather than Cersei. The tension between Jaime and those who had lost family to Lannister campaigns was palpable, yet many recognized his shift in loyalties. He'd left King's Landing behind upon realizing that Cersei would not keep her word to help fight the White Walkers. Now, he wore a plain cloak, half frozen from the northern winds, and a stubbly beard that made him look more rugged than regal. Brienne clasped her thick fingers behind her back as they gazed upon the sprawling camps. The realm has never seen an army like this, she remarked. They come from every corner of Westeros. Some from beyond, if rumors are to be believed. Jaime scanned the scene below, arm resting on the stone battlement. A pity. It took the threat of utter annihilation to bring us together. He turned to glance at her. But if the dead, and something worse than the dead, aren't enough, well, I don't know what would be. Any word on how soon we march? Soon, Brienne replied. Daenerys and Sansa are assembling supply wagons, finalizing routes. We'll need dragonglass, of course, and as much rations as we can carry. Once we cross the lands beyond the wall, hunting becomes scarce. We might glean some game, but not enough for an army this size. Then so. Jaime's golden hand clicked against the stone as he shifted. I've seen many campaigns, but never in such conditions. Marching across frozen tundra into the domain of the White Walkers themselves. It sounds like a mad dream. Brienne looked away, her features taut. Perhaps it is madness, but so is sitting here while that great over, whatever it is, gathers its strength. We owe it to the living to try. Jaime nodded, face solemn. We do. After a moment's hesitation, his voice softened. You've changed, my lady. You were always strong, but now I see a conviction in you that I rarely see in knights who claim it. You wear it well. A faint flush colored Brienne's cheeks, though she did not lower her gaze. We've all changed. Or does that? Their conversation fell silent as a swirl of wind brought a flurry of snow over the battlements. Below, Daenerys emerged from the castle yard, flanked by Grey Worm. The unsullied commander had been overseeing the integration of new recruits into units. Daenerys was heading toward the gate, likely to check on the dragons, or to address some matter with the Dothraki. Jaime and Brienne watched her depart, each lost in their own thoughts. Beyond Winterfell, the once dreaded King's Road was heavy with traffic in both directions. Wagons laden with food, clothing, weapons, and sometimes refugees from smaller northern holdfasts rolled toward the fortress. The common folk, terrified of the unknown, chose to cluster near Winterfell's shadow. They had survived the White Walker onslaught once. They prayed that proximity to the allied armies would protect them if catastrophe struck again. Sansa ordered newly constructed shelters around the keep. Rows of tents, huts of salvaged wood, even lean-tos, sprang up in the fields like mushrooms after a rain. The nights echoed with the coughing of the sick and the murmured prayers of the frightened. The conditions were far from ideal, but at least the castle's walls and thousands of swords offered some sense of security. In these restless days, Arya grew impatient. She missed Jon with an ache that simmered just beneath her steely composure. She prowled the corridors, undertook scouting rides beyond the perimeter, sometimes galloped off for hours only to return with cheeks ruddy from the cold and eyes bright with frustration. She wanted to do more. The dread of waiting gnawed at her, as it did at so many. But the departure for the far north could not come until the combined armies were ready. Meanwhile, in a realm of ice beyond the wall, Jon Snow found himself standing on a snowbound ridge that overlooked a valley perpetually swept by grayish storm clouds. The cold bit at his exposed cheeks and seeped through the furs he wore, though he did not freeze. The power of the White Walkers that laced his blood made him resilient. His thoughts drifted constantly to Winterfell. Some nights, when he stared into the shifting auroras that occasionally lit the sky, he could almost feel Daenerys' presence or picture Arya's determined face, Sansa's calculating gaze, Bran's distant wisdom. Those memories anchored him in the midst of a place that would have otherwise stolen any warmth from his soul. Around him, the White Walkers moved with silent grace. He had learned to discern subtle differences among them. An inclination of the head, a shift of posture, an almost imperceptible hum of energy. Some of them carried slender spears of ice, others cradled curved blades that shimmered with pale frost. When they were not scouting or forging wards near the sinkhole, they would stand still as statues for hours, gazing into a distance Jon could not entirely perceive. They communed with each other in that hush, weaving faint pulses of magic that crackled in the wind. Jon had begun to see glimpses of their civilization, if it could be called that. They had caverns carved into the depths of glaciers, halls of blue ice with columns shaped like twisted spears. In certain recesses, he found swirling patterns etched into the walls, ancient symbols that might predate even the first men. Through his half-connection to them, he caught stray images of how the White Walkers once policed these northern wastes, warding off ancient terrors for centuries. He learned how men eventually pushed north, cutting down the children of the forest, building their own strongholds, and forging unstoppable expansions that threatened the entire balance of this domain. One evening, as the twilight deepened, the Night King beckoned Jon to follow him across a stretch of frozen lake. The moon's reflection shimmered on the glassy surface, marred by cracks beneath the ice that looked like spidery black veins. A trio of White Walkers trailed behind them at a respectful distance, half escort and half retinue. In the center of this vast lake stood a massive ice formation shaped like a broken obelisk. Faintly luminescent, it throbbed with a pale glow. As they drew closer, Jon felt a resonance in his chest, the brand on his palm tingling. He watched as the Night King placed a hand on the obelisk. A swirl of ethereal light danced across the jagged edges of the ice, forming fleeting runes. Jon could not read them. He only knew that they pulsed with the same power that had changed him. The Night King turned, meeting Jon's gaze. In that moment, a surge of memory crashed over Jon, nearly buckling his knees. He saw flashes of the old realms, images of a monstrous silhouette coiling beneath glaciers older than the wall, stirring in dreamless depths for millennia. He saw the children of the forest and the earliest White Walkers forging wards at points across the far north. Black obelisks, ice spires, altars formed from weirwood and frozen stone. They had created a latticework of magical barriers to keep the great other imprisoned. Over the ages, as men forgot the old ways, those wards fell into ruin, leaving cracks. Now, the entity gained strength. John exhaled, breath hissing between his teeth. His head pounded with the weight of knowledge. He took a step back, nearly slipping on the ice. The Night King closed his frosty eyes, and the vision receded. John pressed a hand to his temple, fighting to steady his breath. "So," he said hoarsely, "the wards have broken. We must fix them." He didn't know if he spoke the right words, but the Night King nodded with slow gravity, turning his gaze again to the obelisk. He raised one long pale finger and scratched another rune into the surface. The glow intensified momentarily, then dulled. John sensed that the White Walkers were making desperate attempts to restore these ancient seals, to buy enough time for the living to arrive. But the presence beneath the ice stirred with each passing day, and the wards alone might not suffice. At length, the Night King beckoned John away from the obelisk. They returned across the lake, the White Walkers in tow, the howling wind their only companion. John's mind swam with the revelation. The Great Other was not a vague myth. It was an entity of primal darkness, older than the White Walkers themselves, something that even dragon's fire might struggle to defeat. Could the living and the dead, side by side, trap it again? Or must they risk an outright battle in that sinkhole at the valley's end? When John returned to the main encampment, he found a quiet corner near a ridge. The White Walkers typically glided away to their own tasks, unconcerned with what a mortal might do in his private hours. He knelt in the snow, gazing up at the swirling blackness of the sky. The brand on his palm felt colder than usual, as though the obelisk's power had heightened its potency. Thinking of Winterfell, of Daenerys, of the realm he had sworn to protect, he formed a silent prayer. He had never been one to speak to the gods in elaborate ritual, but he had pleaded to them once or twice. Now, with the fate of everything in the balance, it seemed all the more important to call upon them. Even if the old gods and the new might be powerless against a cosmic darkness that predated them all. "Guide them here," he murmured, voice nearly lost in the wind. "Guide them north, keep them safe, let this alliance hold, let us save this world." As if in answer, the swirling snow gave way for a moment, revealing a narrow band of shimmering lights overhead. Pale green and violet ribbons danced across the sky in a ghostly display. John watched them ripple like curtains drawn across the heavens, faintly illuminating the frozen ridges and the glimmering armor of the distant White Walkers. For one breath, he imagined it was a sign of hope. The next morning, he woke to find a hush across the encampment. The White Walkers lingered at the edges, gazing toward the horizon. John followed their collective stare. Dark clouds marred the northern skies, a boiling turbulence that reminded him of a bruise on flesh. Intermittent flashes glowed within that swirling mass, not quite lightning but something akin to it. Even from a distance, he sensed the menacing aura. It seemed the Great Other flexed its power, sending storms across the land in search of fresh cracks in the wards. Gritting his teeth, John pressed a hand to the brand on his palm. He willed that connection to the Weirwood network and to the White Walker hostage who remained in Winterfell. They must come, he thought, forcing the idea outward as if it were a prayer. They must hurry. In Winterfell, at that very hour, Bran Stark jolted awake in his bedchamber, the old one that once belonged to the younger Starks. A wave of cold energy rolled through him, a faint echo of the brand on Jon's palm. He gasped, sweat beading on his brow despite the frigid temperature. The direwolf sigil embroidered on the thick bed cover seemed to move in the flickering candlelight. He blinked rapidly, orienting himself. Then, summoning what he had gleaned of his green sight, he glimpsed a swirl of gray storms, saw the faint silhouette of Jon Snow, and sensed the echo of that silent plea. "Hurry." He swung his legs over the edge of the bed, calling for Podrick. "Help me to the godswood," Bran said. "I need to speak with the others now." Within half an hour, an urgent council convened in the Great Hall. Daenerys, Sansa, Arya, Tyrion, Grey Worm, Davos, Brienne, Tormund, and Jaime among them. The hall was awash in torchlight, as outside it was still dark, well before dawn. Soldiers in the yard clutched spears and swords, uncertain why they had been roused early. Muffled voices drifted in through the hall's thick doors. The flicker of torches danced across the faces of the assembled leaders, revealing tension carved into every brow. Bran sat with stiff posture in his wheeled chair, his eyes still carrying the remnants of that haunted expression. Sansa rested a comforting hand on his shoulder. "Tell us," she prompted softly, voice echoing. Bran's gaze slid to Daenerys, and then around the table. Jon sent a warning. "The great Other's power grows. The wards that the White Walkers are attempting to reinforce may fail soon. If that happens, the darkness will spill across the land without restraint. Jon, he urges us to come now." "Then tell." Daenerys' lips parted. Her eyes shone with a mix of apprehension and something steely. She wanted to protect her people, but also, she desperately wanted to see Jon. She turned to Tyrion, who stood near a table heaped with maps and scribbled notes. "We have nearly everyone we can muster," she said. "We're still waiting on word from a few outlying lords, but we can't afford to linger any longer." Tyrion steepled his fingers, glancing at the lines on the map. "It will take time for the entire host to march. If we set out immediately, some smaller contingents might have to catch up. The weather is brutal. We risk losing men to the cold, to exposure, our supply lines." "We can wait," Sansa interrupted, her voice sharp but not unkind. "We'll need to rely on speed rather than perfect logistics. The window for success is closing." "Then?" Tormund bellowed in agreement, his booming voice echoing off the walls. "The cold won't get any better if we wait, and the free folk have made it this far. We've got men who know how to travel in these conditions. Let us do it while we still have a chance." Jaime tapped a gloved hand on the table, his golden hand resting on his hip. "What of the approach? The paths beyond the wall are treacherous. Some are blocked by collapsed ice, thanks to Viserion's destruction of the wall. We may need to cut around to the gates that remain intact." "Nadine." Davos cleared his throat. "Eastwatch might be the best option. If we gather ships to ferry us up the coast, we could avoid traveling the King's Road all the way to the collapsed portion near the Shivering Sea. But that also takes time." Daenerys shook her head. "Time is what we do not have. We'll march by land if we must. The dragons will scout ahead. They can help us navigate the safest route to cross. We must do it." A solemn hush fell. The only sound was the crackle of the large hearth. Arya clenched her jaw and spoke softly. "We ride for Jon. We ride for the realm. No more discussion." Bran gave a faint nod. "I will do what I can through the weirwoods to guide us, though my visions are clouded by the storms in the far north." Daenerys looked around, meeting each gaze. She saw fear in some eyes, resolve in others. No one here was ignorant of the danger. Even the bravest might be uneasy about riding into unknown horrors. Yet none flinched, none withdrew. Their path was set. "Then we march at first light," she said, voice carrying the authority of a queen. "Prepare the men. We take only what we can carry, only what's necessary for survival. The rest must be left behind. Winterfell can hold out with a small garrison to protect the non-combatants." "Then no one." Sansa glanced at Brienne, then at Tyrion. "I'll stay," Sansa said. Her calm features betrayed no doubt. "I must see to the North's future. Someone must remain in case the worst should happen. If all of us go and fail, who would carry on?" She swallowed, eyes flicking to Bran, who gave an understanding nod. "I will hold Winterfell as the last line of defense. That is my role." "Damn." Arya's protest formed on her lips, but Sansa's gaze was firm. They both remembered the vow Sansa once made, that there must always be a Stark in Winterfell. This was their home, their legacy. Sansa would fulfill that duty, no matter how badly it hurt to stay behind. Daenerys touched her arm gently. "Winterfell will be in good hands." That day, the entire fortress erupted into a maelstrom of activity. Horns sounded, summoning every able-bodied fighter. Banners rippled in the frigid wind. The direwolf of House Stark, the three-headed dragon of House Targaryen, the lion of House Lannister, carried now by Jaime's loyal men, and countless smaller sigils from lesser houses across the realm. Blacksmiths hammered away at final repairs and sharpened swords. Leatherworkers hurried to reinforce straps and seams. The stables bustled with war horses being saddled, while the Dothraki tended to their mounts with swift efficiency. Food was loaded into wagons. Salted meats, hard biscuits, oats, dried fruits, barrels of fresh water. The knowledge that they might have to rely on meager game as they pressed north weighed on everyone. But survival demanded minimal baggage if they wanted to reach Jon Snow and the White Walkers in time. By midday, the sky glowed with a watery sun. The enormous host began to file out of Winterfell's gate in columns that snaked across the frozen fields. Daenerys rode at the forefront, flanked by Grey Worm and Jorah Mormont, still alive and scarred from previous battles. Tyrion rode in a covered wagon near the front, not the greatest rider but determined to keep pace. Arya joined a contingent of scouts, who rode ahead to ensure the path was clear of hazards. Brienne, Podrick, and Jaime led various battalions, forming a disciplined vanguard. Tormund and the Free Folk took up positions near the front lines, claiming they could sense danger in the wind. Overhead, Drogon and Rhaegal soared, each a dark silhouette against the white sky. The beating of their wings rumbled like distant thunder. The men marching below could not help but stare, some in awe, others in trepidation. Dragons were as terrifying as they were magnificent. But in the face of cosmic darkness, terror was a weapon they needed. They marched north, beyond the shell of civilization. The farmland gave way to barren fields of snow, dotted with skeletal trees. Frost-laden winds whipped across the columns, turning cheeks red and leaving lips chapped. As night approached, they made camp in a broad valley. Fires sprang to life in carefully dug pits, ringed by stones to block the wind. Tents sprang up in neat rows, and the air smelled of horse sweat, leather, and wood smoke. Daenerys took minimal shelter, choosing to remain close to her dragons. The night grew quiet, but for the low murmur of conversation, the occasional bray of a horse, and the distant, mournful cry of a lonely direwolf, somewhere in the hills. Arya, huddled by a fire with the scouts, sharpened her dagger and stared into the embers, haunted by the memory of the White Walkers. The older scouts looked to her. She had killed a Night King once before, or so rumor said, though the truth was more complicated. Nevertheless, her presence reassured them. Morning broke with pale sunlight. They continued on, pressing deeper into the northern wilderness. On the second day, they skirted the flanks of a frozen lake. On the third, they traversed narrow passes where the snow piled high. Men took to hacking at the drifts with shovels to clear a path for the wagons. Despite the drudgery, their spirits remained intact, fueled by the knowledge that if they failed to reach Jon in time, no one else would. The wind carried a faint sense of foreboding, as though the very land braced for calamity. On the fifth day, they reached the ruins of the wall's eastern portion. Viserion's icy breath had torn it down months before, leaving behind ragged spires of ice and deep rubble. In places, the path was choked with collapsed stones, but there were gaps. Daenerys ordered her men to carefully guide the wagons through. A hush fell as they passed beyond the invisible line that had once defined the boundary between the Seven Kingdoms and the Wild. Tormund let out a deep breath. "This is the land of my people," he said to no one in particular, "and even I don't like how it feels now." Grey Worm's stoic gaze swept over the endless expanse of white. "We keep moving." They pressed onward, forging new trails through heavy snow. The deeper they went, the less recognizable the terrain became. It was as if the storms had reshaped everything, burying old landmarks. Even Tormund had to rely on guesswork, scanning the sun's position whenever it was visible. Bran, riding in a reinforced wagon near the front, often slipped into a half-trance to glean glimpses from the ravens overhead or through the heart trees scattered in the north. But the storms were thick, and the great Over's presence distorted his vision, leaving him with only fleeting impressions. Still, in those scattered images, he sensed Jon, and the sense of time running short. Daenerys took to flying part of the way on Drogon, scanning for hazards. Rhaegal followed, sometimes carrying a scout or two. They found twisted, icy canyons, half-frozen rivers, suspiciously thin ice in some places that threatened to swallow wagons. The dragons roared warnings, guiding the host onto firmer ground. Each day was a slow battle against the environment, but the columns marched resolutely. At night, the howling wind never ceased. It battered tents and whistled over the ridgelines with a bone-chilling moan. Men huddled in furs, passing skins of ale or mulled wine to keep warm. Sometimes they sang old campfire songs, voices trembling, the lyrics muffled by the gusts. Each sunrise was greeted with relief. Another night survived. But with each day's progress, the tension rose, for they knew they approached whatever doom Jon had foreseen. At last, after nearly 3 weeks of arduous travel, they reached a plateau that overlooked a vast frozen valley. The snow lay in unbroken drifts, save for a network of winding paths that cut across to the far side, where the land rose in jagged, ominous peaks. The wind blew with ceaseless fury. High overhead, ragged clouds tore across the sky, revealing fleeting glimpses of a pale sun. Daenerys soared on Drogon, scanning the horizon. Then she spotted something, a cluster of pale shapes, gliding over the snow. She guided Drogon lower. With a roar that echoed over the valley, the dragon descended toward the main body of the army. A swirl of snow enveloped them as Drogon's massive wings beat the air. Men shielded their faces. Daenerys shouted down, "White Walkers ahead!" The entire host tensed. Soldiers formed ranks, some drawing weapons, expecting a fight. Grey Worm barked commands in the melodic language of the Unsullied. Knights checked the straps on their helms, the edges of their swords, the fit of their shields. But Daenerys' next words cut through the swirling chaos. They don't appear hostile. They're waiting. Bendawal. Waiting. The words settled among them like a stone in water. Arya nudged her horse forward, scanning the valley with keen eyes. Indeed, far in the distance, she could discern faint shapes, a row of tall, pale figures, still as gravestones, facing the vantage from which the living came. Tormund let out a bark of incredulous laughter. "So, they expect us like dinner guests." No one truly smiled at his jest. Tyrion, his face half hidden by a heavy scarf, squinted at the shapes. "It's their welcoming party. I'd rather skip the feast." Daenerys circled once more, then landed near the front lines. She slid off Drogon's back and joined the others. "We move forward," she declared, voice carrying despite the wind. "This is why we've come. Brace yourselves, but do not attack unless they give us reason. Jon must be near." The combined army advanced slowly across the valley, horns sounding to keep them together in the whipping snow. For many, it was a surreal tableau. Men riding toward a line of White Walkers, those same enemies they had bled and died fighting not so long ago. Every heart hammered with fear of betrayal, but the pact was clear. Jon had trusted them, and the Night King had agreed to it. They had to rely on that fragile faith. As they drew nearer, each White Walker's form became more distinct. They wore that spiky armor of bluish ice. Some carried spears or swords, yet none were raised in threat. Their pale eyes glimmered beneath the dull sunlight. In their midst, a single figure stepped forward, a man wrapped in black furs, a sword at his belt. Jon Snow. He looked thinner, paler, and, perhaps strangest of all, his hair carried a streak of white from the temple back through the rest. His eyes flicked with an unearthly light that had not been there before, as if touched by the same cold fire that animated the others. Yet as soon as Daenerys and Arya dismounted and hurried forward, they saw it was undeniably him. The line of White Walkers parted like a curtain, giving him space to step out onto the snow alone. Daenerys' voice trembled with a swirl of emotions. "Jon." She nearly stumbled in the drifts as she ran the last few steps, ignoring every caution, every memory of how dangerous the White Walkers could be. Jon caught her in an embrace. For a moment, It was as though the entire world narrowed to just the two of them. She pressed her face to his chest, feeling the unnatural chill radiating from him, but she did not care. He was alive. Arya approached, body taut, scanning the White Walkers around them. Yet she, too, paused to look at Jon. "You look terrible," she said, though the relief in her eyes was unmistakable. A quiet, breathy laugh escaped Jon. "Good to see you too, little sister." He glanced behind them, seeing the enormous host arrayed in cautious ranks. Dragons circled above, and further back, tens of thousands of men stood ready for war. His face carried a haunted cast. "Thank you for coming." Daenerys pulled back enough to see his eyes. "We'd march to the ends of the world for you, Jon. But tell us, is it too late? What must we do?" He exhaled. "Not too late. Yet. But we're close. The wards are failing. The Night King and his White Walkers have been struggling to keep them intact, but the great other stirs beneath the ice. We'll need every sword, every bit of dragon fire, and more. I'm not sure if even that will be enough, but we have to try." "Ben?" She nodded firmly, pressing a gloved hand to his cheek. "We're here. We stand together." A hush had fallen across the valley. Men stared with wide eyes, still stunned at the sight of their former foe calmly watching them. The Night King himself emerged from among the ranks of White Walkers, his tall form unmistakable. Clad in that spined armor, with eyes of luminescent blue, he strode forward until he stood level with Jon and Daenerys. A ripple of fear spread among the living. Some hands tightened on sword hilts or spear shafts. Grey Worm was among them, scanning the White King's every movement, ready to give the order to strike if needed. Tyrion, who had inched closer, fought to steady his breathing. He had never been this close to the Night King, and retained his wits. The Night King regarded Daenerys with that same, impassive gaze. His eyes flicked to Drogon, who landed behind the lines, stirring a whirlwind of snow and cold air. For a breath, it seemed the two might clash. Ancient ice creature and living dragon, emblems of two primal forces. But then the Night King dipped his head in a gesture so small it might have been missed by all but those nearest. Jon looked between them, uncertain how to interpret the gesture. Slowly, tentatively, Daenerys inclined her head in return, acknowledging this fragile alliance. Tension crackled in the air. Arya's voice cut through the hush. "So we are allies now," she said, carefully picking her words. "In the face of something even worse than you." She eyed the Night King. The corner of her mouth twitched. "Never thought I'd see the day." Jon looked at her wearily. "There's no other choice. If we don't stand together, we'll all be consumed." A dull rumble beneath their feet seemed to underscore that warning, as if the land itself groaned. The assembled White Walkers shifted, a whisper of movement. The living host muttered anxiously, horses stamping, men adjusting their grips on reins and blades. Jon ran a hand over his pale-streaked hair. "We should set up camp on the ridges to the south. The White Walkers have an encampment deeper in that valley, near an ice chasm that leads to the Great Odor's lair. The wards are anchored there, at least the largest of them. That's where we'll make our stand." Daenerys gave a curt nod. "Then let's waste no time." She gestured for Grey Worm to relay orders to the columns. The horn sounded anew, and the slow, methodical process of dividing the army into logical segments began. One for the ridge, another for the forward lines, still others to guard the supply wagons. All the while, the White Walkers stood by, watching with eerie silence. Arya kept a firm hand near her sword's hilt, mindful that any misstep could trigger chaos. As if reading her thoughts, the slender White Walker who had remained in Winterfell now came forward, stepping lightly across the snow to rejoin its brethren. A flicker of recognition passed through the gathered others. Their hostage had come home. It inclined its head toward Jon in silent confirmation. The pact had been honored. Through that day, and into nightfall, the combined forces began to dig in. The living camp sprawled along the rocky ridges, while the White Walkers maintained their own cluster in the valley. It was a bizarre, mirror-like arrangement. Fires burning bright on one side, the pale glimmer of unnatural cold on the other. In between, a swath of no man's land marked the neutral ground. Rhaegal and Drogon perched on crags, scanning the surroundings with watchful reptilian eyes. Jon led Daenerys, Arya, Tyrion, Tormund, Brienne, and a handful of other key commanders to the heart of the White Walker domain. The landscape opened onto a wide basin of ice, pitted with jagged fissures that vented strange vapors. In the center stood a circle of pillars, frozen wards etched with runes, reminiscent of the one Jon had seen in the middle of the lake. Some glowed faintly, others flickered as if about to fail. The Night King was there, along with a few of his highest lieutenants. They stood around the circle, their postures radiating tension. Bran, accompanied by Podrick, arrived after a short delay, brought on a sledge pulled by a massive northern horse. He took in the wards with calm curiosity, though a sheen of sweat glistened on his brow despite the cold. The presence of such powerful magic weighed on him. When the Night King gestured to one of the pillars, Bran leaned forward in his seat, eyes flickering with the sight only he could see. He spoke in a hushed tone, as if translating. Each pillar is bound to a larger matrix beneath the ice, chaining the darkness. They're anchored by runes from both the Children of the Forest and older tongues I don't recognize. The White Walkers have done what they can to keep them intact, but the Great Other has been weakening them from within. Tyrion rubbed his chin, his breath forming clouds. And how do we reinforce them? If these wards are our first line of defense, we need to know how to strengthen them or restore them to full potency. Bran's eyes distant, he listened to something no one else could hear. We need ancient magic, Children of the Forest magic. But they're nearly gone, as far as we know. Perhaps a handful remain, if any. The weirwood trees might help, or the dragonglass the Night King once feared. Fire, too, can serve as a catalyst. But the final piece is blood. Blood of those who share the old magic. He glanced at Jon, whose brand faintly glistened with frost. Then he glanced at Arya, and even Sansa, though she was miles away. Stark blood. Arya's mouth quirked in a grim half-smile. So that's us. The last living offshoots of a line older than the Andals. I suppose we'd better do our part. Jon hesitated. I've got the brand, yes, but we might need more. The White Walkers require living energy to power these wards. A living sacrifice, or at least a living infusion. I'm not entirely sure how it works, but I can feel it calling, like a thirst in the ice. So. Daenerys' face paled. Are we speaking of killing someone to fuel these wards? The Night King flicked his eyes to Jon, as though passing a question. Jon bowed his head. No, he said with quiet certainty. It doesn't need to be lethal, not if done properly. A few drops of blood might suffice. But it must be done carefully, in a ritual that merges the living with this old magic. Otherwise it would kill the participant outright. The Night King used my blood once to anchor me to this realm. Something similar, but on a grander scale, is required to anchor the wards. So. Tormund scowled. Blood magic. Never liked the sound of that. But if that's the cost of keeping this Great Other locked away, I'd say it's a bargain compared to letting it roam free. Jon nodded. We will attempt that. But if it fails, we must be ready to fight. And if it breaks free despite everything, well, that's why we have an army, and dragons, and all of us. The wards, even repaired, may only buy us time for a final confrontation. Brienne kept a hand on the hilt of Oathkeeper. And how do we fight an ancient godlike being? Even the White Walkers fear it. No one answered immediately. The wind hissed, whipping loose snow into swirling eddies around the circle of pillars. At last, Daenerys spoke with quiet resolve. We do what must be done. We fight with dragon's fire, with Valyrian steel, with dragonglass, with every ounce of courage we have. If the wards cannot hold it, we meet it with all the wrath of the living. I lost one dragon already to the White Walkers. I will not see another stolen or destroyed if I can help it. But if that is the price for the world, then so be it. Then the Night King stood impassive, listening without uttering a word. Through that silent link he and Jon communicated enough to convey that at sunrise, they would attempt the bloodbinding to rejuvenate the wards. The living forces were advised to keep watch in case the ritual disturbed the Great Other. Should the entity stir violently, the White Walkers would be the first to sense it. They parted ways. The living retreated to their encampment, setting up a perimeter, doubling the guard, sending out scouts in every direction. Daenerys soared back to her men on Drogon. Tyrion spent the night poring over musty tomes he had dragged from Winterfell's library, scanning for any reference to such ancient rituals. Arya prowled the edges of the camp, restless, one eye on the White Walker's domain, one hand on Needle's hilt. Jon lingered near the ward circle for a time, speaking quietly with the Night King through that intangible mental link. He gleaned the steps of the ritual, though they came in fragments of images and half-remembered spells from epochs long past. Morning arrived, gray and frigid. The wind had mercifully calmed, leaving the land in a deathly stillness. A hush fell over the valley as the living gathered at a distance around the pillars. The White Walkers formed a circle opposite them. In the center, Jon, Bran, Arya, and a few other chosen participants stepped onto the ice. Daenerys watched from behind them, eyes shining with concern. The dragons perched on a nearby ledge, rumbling softly. Bran guided Jon and Arya in how to stand before each pillar, placing their hands on the etched runes. The Night King moved to an opposite pillar, and another White Walker joined him. At once, the ancient circle glimmered with faint lines of frost. Jon took a deep breath, exchanging a glance with Arya. She gave a small nod, pressing her hand to one pillar's surface. Instantly, she gasped, frost snaking over her fingertips. But she held her ground. Jon pressed the scarred palm where the Night King had cut him so long ago. The moment his flesh touched the rune, the brand flared with cold light. A wave of dizziness rocked him. His ears rang. Darkness flickered at the edges of his vision, and he swore he heard the distant wail of something beyond the veil of ice. A high, keening cry, like a beast awakening. Bran murmured, words no one else understood, half in the old tongue of the children of the forest, half in a language lost to time. The Night King lifted his spear of ice, reversing it so the butt end touched the ground. Pale energy crackled along its length. The other White Walker raised a blade. The runes on the pillars throbbed with light, intensifying from pale white to glacial blue. In unison, the White Walkers near the circle lifted their arms, channeling their power, while Jon and Arya felt a sharp sting on their palms. Blue-white light flared around them. Arya hissed in pain but did not withdraw her hand. Jon set his jaw. Flecks of ice formed across his skin, creeping up his forearm. He felt blood trickle from the brand, freezing almost instantly. The pillar pulsed, drawing the droplets into its surface. For a few heartbeats, it seemed to be working. Energy radiated from the pillars, streaking across the ice to connect them in a lattice of glowing lines. The watchers from the living side murmured in astonishment. Then the ground rumbled, a deep, ominous vibration that made men stumble and horses whinny in alarm. Something roared beneath the earth, an inhuman shriek of rage. The lines of energy flickered, as if battered by a terrible force. Within the runes on the pillars, spiderweb cracks appeared. The light sputtered. Jon clenched his teeth, forcing more of his own strength into the bond. Arya's eyes went wide, sweat beading on her brow despite the cold. Bran continued chanting, his own lips turning pale. A cracking noise tore through the morning stillness. One of the pillars burst, shards of ice flying in all directions. Jon wrenched his hand away just in time, shielding his face. Arya ducked, nearly losing her footing. The Night King stood unmoving, his visage carved with grim finality. Another pillar shattered. Bran gasped, voice trembling. It's too strong. The Great Other is pushing back. The wards can't hold it. A guttural moan rippled across the ice. In the distance, men cried out as fissures opened in the valley floor. Steam and black vapors poured forth, carrying the stench of decay and ancient rot. Horses reared, scattering. Daenerys lunged forward, shouting for everyone to fall back. Jon staggered, trying to remain in place, determined to give the ritual one last chance. He poured his will into the swirling magic, ignoring the shards of ice that slashed his cheek. The lines on the ground flared again, but the darkness below roared in defiance. Another pillar exploded, sending hailstones of ice into the air. A jolt of dark energy slammed into John, ripping him away from the pillar. He landed hard on his back, skidding across the ice. His vision swam. He was vaguely aware of Arya crying out as she too was hurled aside. The entire circle was collapsing. The Night King stood rooted in place, his spear raised, as if trying to channel more power. But even his formidable magic buckled under the onslaught. The ice at his feet fissured. A swirl of black smoke exploded from below, enveloping him in a momentary shroud. Daenerys shouted, "Retreat!" But the wind carried her voice away. Men sprinted forward to pull Jon and Arya out of harm's way. Tormund and Grey Worm led a wedge of soldiers onto the ice, ignoring the splintering cracks, to rescue those near the wards. Meanwhile, the White Walkers found themselves forced back. Whites, once under their command, staggered and convulsed as if some other force threatened to claim them. Then, with a roar that shook the heavens, the ice at the center of the circle gave way. A vast sinkhole yawned open, spiraling downward into unseen depths. Black tendrils of mist slithered upward, forming grotesque shapes that flickered in and out of sight. It was as if the land had torn a hole in its very flesh, exposing the beating heart of an unimaginable horror. A wave of pure dread washed across the battlefield. Jon coughed, chest burning as Tormund helped him up. He looked to the shattered pillars, to the Night King, who stood near the edge of the newly opened chasm. For the first time, the Night King's eyes showed something akin to fear, or at least recognition of a power even he could not master. Bran's voice reached Jon through the howling wind. "It's free!" Bran cried, shaking in Podrick's arms. "The wards are gone. The great other rises." From the pit came another thunderous roar, like 1,000 voices screaming in unison. The swirling blackness began to coalesce into a shape, a twisting, serpentine body of shadow, crowned by shards of ice, eyes glowing red with unholy malice. The ground quaked violently. Chasms snaked outward from the sinkhole, swallowing entire clusters of soldiers who could not move quickly enough. Panic seized the living. Commands shouted across the valley were drowned by the cacophony. The White Walkers, likewise, retreated in disarray, their usual poise shattered by the unstoppable fury welling from the bowels of the earth. High above, Drogon and Rhaegal screeched, beating their wings in alarm. Jon fought to find Daenerys amid the chaos. She stood near a broken pillar, half buried in snow, eyes locked on the gargantuan shade rising from the pit. Her face was drawn, a reflection of the horror that had been unleashed. Their attempt to reinforce the wards had failed, and now the final nightmare had come. The great other howled, the vibrations alone enough to crack the ice further. Then it began to surge forward, flowing more than walking, a sinuous wave of living darkness streaked with ice. It set its gaze on the largest cluster of living soldiers, near the southern ridge. With a shriek that seemed to tear open the sky, the entity lashed out. A spear of black mist, crackling with eldritch frost, hurtled across the valley. It struck the ground among the men, igniting in a burst of freezing flame. Screams filled the air as entire lines of soldiers were petrified in ice or consumed by ephemeral black fire. Daenerys' heart seized. She scrambled to her feet, yanking the reins of a frightened horse that had nearly bolted. "We have to fight," she shouted, though the men around her reeled in terror. Grey Worm managed to bark orders in the unsullied tongue, trying to rally them. Jon, battered and bleeding, forced himself to stand. "Archers, loose arrows," he roared. "Form lines, don't let it sweep us apart." Brienne and Jaime, having regrouped with a cadre of knights, formed a shield wall. Arrows studded the air, aimed at the writhing darkness. They vanished into the great over's swirling mass, seemingly without effect. Another screech rent the skies. The entity slid forward, leaving trails of black ice behind. The living were forced to scatter. Rhaegal and Drogon descended, spewing torrents of dragon flame. For a moment, the brilliance of fire lit the valley, reflecting on the glassy ice. The monstrous entity recoiled, but not as a mortal creature would recoil from flame. It twisted, shrieked, yet part of it continued moving, swirling around the flames as if seeking a path to slip past them. Still, Daenerys saw that the dragonflame hurt it. Chunks of its shadowy form hissed and sloughed away when touched by the inferno. Perhaps it could be wounded, perhaps even destroyed, if they could pin it in place. But the Great Other was ancient, cunning, and furious. It conjured another spear of black frost, hurling it upward at Drogon. Daenerys' heart lurched as she saw the projectile coming. She pulled on the reins, urging Drogon to bank. The spear grazed the dragon's flank, leaving a swath of glimmering ice crystals that smoked on contact. Drogon roared in pain, nearly tossing Daenerys from the saddle. They spun away, battered by the wind. Rhaegal fared little better, weaving around the creature's lashing tendrils, but unable to land a decisive blow. The knights and foot soldiers below tried to maintain discipline, charging in waves, but each time they approached, the Great Other unleashed swirling blasts of darkness that froze or consumed them. Dozens fell within the first few minutes. The White Walkers, scattered along one edge of the battlefield, regrouped under the Night King's command. With a gesture, he summoned a wave of ice magic that surged from the ground. Towering spikes of frost that hammered into the Great Other's flank. The creature bellowed, thrashing. For a moment, it recoiled again, giving the living forces a reprieve. Then, with a fury that transcended words, it turned upon the White Walkers. Tendrils of black miasma launched across the ice, curling around a cluster of White Walkers. They shrieked in a language unknown to men, hacking with their crystalline blades. But the dark tendrils enveloped them, snuffing out the pale glow of their eyes. One by one, their forms hardened into lumps of black ice before collapsing into dust, devoured by the cosmic hatred that birthed the Great Other. Jon witnessed it all in horror. He and Arya had managed to regroup near a broken wagon. Bran, half-conscious, clung to Podrick's shoulder. Tyrion crouched behind an overturned sled, face ashen, watching the unstoppable devastation. "Gods preserve us," Tyrion muttered, knuckles white. "We have to fall back," Jon shouted, voice raw. "We're too exposed here. Our only chance is to draw it out, lure it into open ground, then focus all our might, dragons, White Walker magic, everything, on it at once." Arya, panting, blood streaking her brow, nodded. "But it moves faster than we can run. We need to strike it from multiple angles at once, or it'll pick us off." She glanced at the swirling mass, noticing how it recoiled from direct flame. "If the dragons can keep the fire on it, maybe that will give us time to land a killing blow." Bran stirred, lifting his head. His pupils were dilated. "We must keep it from retreating to the depths," he said, voice faint. "If it senses it's outmatched, it may slip back underground and spread its darkness in ways we can't contain. This is our only chance to face it in the open." Jon helped Bran onto a horse. "Can you guide us? Use your sight to coordinate the attacks." Bran struggled to remain upright, pain etched on his features. "I can try. My link to the Weirwoods is overshadowed, but I might speak to the Ravens and the White Walkers if the Night King is willing." "Nendesir." Tyrion exhaled shakily, scanning the battlefield. "Then we'd better do it quickly. The men are losing hope." Jon tried to catch the Night King's attention across the shifting chaos. Their eyes locked. Another swirl of half-coherent images burst in Jon's mind. The Night King's vow to fight this horror, the knowledge that it had to be contained here and now or everything, living and dead, would be lost. They had come too far to fail. "Yes," Jon breathed. "We do it together. Now." He motioned to Arya, Tormund, and Brienne, instructing them to rally as many fighters as possible on the southern flank. Grey Worm and Davos, if they still lived, would gather others to form a pincer around the Great Other. The White Walkers, under the Night King, would assault from the north. Meanwhile, Daenerys and her dragons would strike from above, saturating the beast with fire. And Jon would attempt to deliver a blow from within. Perhaps the brand on his palm could channel enough magic to wound the Great Other at close range, if he could approach it from behind while it was distracted. It was a desperate plan, but desperation was all they had. While Tormund thundered off, rallying survivors with wild bellows. Brienne sprinted through the carnage, her golden hair glinting in the eerie light, calling knights to form up. Arya disappeared into the confusion, her footsteps silent. Jon trusted she would be there at the critical moment. Tyrion and Bran rode off together, Podrick leading the horse, heading toward the White Walker lines to facilitate the combined assault. Jon took a deep breath, scanning the skies for Daenerys. Drogon and Rhaegal circled overhead, unleashing gouts of flame whenever the Great Other reared up to strike. The monstrous entity thrashed, half its form seeming to melt away under intense heat. But it would then writhe and reform, black ice laced with swirling shadows. Each blast of dragonfire slowed it, forced it to recoil, but it didn't die. Its unholy shrieks filled the air. Jon forced his trembling legs to move, bounding across broken ice and around the shattered remains of the warding pillars. He gripped Longclaw at his side, though he doubted Valyrian steel alone could slay a cosmic entity. Perhaps, with the Bran's magic, it would do more harm. He clenched his wounded palm, feeling the chill that signaled the White Walker's power. As he neared the Great Other, the stench of rot and ancient filth overwhelmed him. He gagged, raising an arm to shield his nose. The swirling mass towered overhead, locked in a fierce exchange with the White Walkers on one side and the living on the other. Searing flames from Rhaegal forced it to contract, then a volley of ice spears from the Night King hammered into its flank. It shrieked, recoiling. Now, Jon thought, this is my chance. He sprinted around a jagged block of ice, coming at the beast from behind. Streams of black fluid hissed as they dripped from the entity's wounds, sizzling on the ice. The air crackled with unnatural energy. Jon felt the brand on his palm burn with cold intensity. Each step felt like wading through a nightmare. The shadows churned around him, whispering half-formed voices. 1,000 lifetimes of hatred battered his senses, but he pressed on. He spotted a writhing root-like column of shadow on the Great Other's back, some point where lumps of black ice converged. It looked vaguely like a spine, if the entity had anything approaching normal anatomy. If there was a vulnerable spot, that might be it. Summoning every ounce of courage, Jon drew Longclaw, the Valyrian steel gleaming with hoarfrost. With a roar, he leapt toward that writhing mass, driving his blade forward. The metal bit into the black ice, and a shriek tore through the air. The Great Other convulsed, sending arcs of freezing energy coursing around Jon Donne. He howled in pain, feeling his flesh freeze and burn at once. Still, he held on, twisting the sword deeper. Through his brand, he poured the White Walker's power, the living's resilience, all of it, into that strike. A swirl of images flooded his mind. The children of the forest forging the first White Walker. The original Night King, kneeling in blood and snow. Centuries of watchers on the wall, brave men who had defended the realms. The heartbreak of Winterfell burning under Theon's betrayal. The alliances. The betrayals. Daenerys risking everything to save mankind. Arya's unwavering loyalty. Sansa's quiet resilience. Every life lost to this war. Every chance at tomorrow. With a final, furious effort, Jon jammed Longclaw deeper. The Great Other's shriek peaked, and a massive pulse of energy blasted outward. All around the valley, men and White Walkers alike were blown to the ground. The dragons recoiled, screaming. The ice cracked, spiderwebbing in all directions. Then, for one breathless moment, the Great Other went still, as though locked in silent agony. Its swirling mass rippled, turning from black to a faintly translucent gray. Jon, pinned to its side, clutched Longclaw, teeth chattering. His vision blurred, fighting unconsciousness. But the Great Other was not dead. With a hideous groan, it flexed, tearing free of the sword's point. The blade was wrenched from Jon's grip, embedded in the twisting mass. A black tendril lashed out, slamming him to the ground. He hit the ice so hard he felt bones crack. Gasping in pain, he tried to rise, but his limbs refused to obey. The beast turned its attention to him, eyes of roiling crimson peering through the swirling shadows. Jon could taste blood in his mouth. The cold soared to an impossible intensity. He sensed that in another heartbeat, the Great Other would crush him, unmake him in that swirl of darkness. Suddenly, a fierce war cry cut through the chaos, and Arya burst into view. She jumped onto a shard of broken ice, launching herself at the great over's flank with a lithe grace. Her Valyrian dagger flashed, the same that had once ended a Night King. She drove it into the writhing mass near where Longclaw protruded. Simultaneously above them, Drogon raked the creature's upper form with dragon flame. The great other jerked backward in a manic thrash, trying to dodge the flame and the stab at once. Arya hung on, her dagger buried in the swirling blackness. She looked down at Jon, eyes wide with desperation. "Move!" she shouted. Jon summoned the last of his strength, rolling aside as the great other smashed a monstrous limb down where he had been. Ice erupted in a deadly spray. Then the thunder of hooves and the roar of men broke across the battlefield. Brienne, Jaime, Grey Worm, Tormund, they all came charging, having reformed their lines. A phalanx of unsullied braced spears layered with dragon glass, ramming them into the great over's lower mass. Knights flung jars of wildfire that exploded, sending green flames licking at the shadow. The White Walkers pressed from the opposite side, the Night King channeling blasts of ice that froze parts of the great other's swirling shape, allowing dragon flame to scorch it. The valley became a cataclysm of chaos. Bursts of fire, showers of black ice, screams of terror, roars of defiance. Arya jumped free at the last moment, landing heavily but rolling to her feet. The great other howled, battered from all sides, unable to withdraw back into the chasm thanks to the combined assault. Here, above ground, the living and the dead had synergy. It writhed, lashing out, but the circle was closing. In that final crescendo, Daenerys soared down with Drogon, unleashing the fiercest stream of dragon flame yet. The White Walkers hammered the beast with ice lances. The men lunged with dragonglass-laden spears. Jon, ignoring his cracked ribs and battered limbs, reached for a broken spear of dragonglass that lay near him. He forced himself upright, step by agonizing step, until he stood next to the creature's half-frozen flank. With a shout, he drove the spear into the same wound he had opened with Longclaw, channeling all the cold fury of the brand into it. An agonized shriek shredded the air. The great other convulsed, its swirling body unraveling in a nightmarish dance. Chunks of black ice dissolved into vapor. It tried to lash out again, but the blow fell short, sithing harmlessly through the air. Flames and shards of frost hammered it from every side. With a final harrowing wail, the monstrous entity collapsed inward, as if imploding under its own darkness. A vortex of swirling black mist spun at the center of the chasm, then dispersed into the wind, leaving only the ring of scorched, shattered ice where it had stood. The sudden quiet was deafening. The wind, the screams, the roars, all seemed muted in that moment. Men stared with wide, disbelieving eyes. The White Walkers stood still, their heads inclined toward the site of the great over's demise. The dragons circled overhead, panting, smoke trailing from their jaws. Amid the broken ice and drifting snow, Jon stood, wavering on his feet. His body felt numb, his mind rattled by what he had witnessed. He saw Arya slumped on her knees, blood trickling down her temple. Daenerys slid from Drogon's shoulder to run to Jon, heart pounding in her chest. She reached him just as he began to crumple, catching him in her arms. He looked into her eyes. "Is it gone?" he whispered, voice rasping with pain. She swept aside the hair sticking to his forehead, tears on her cheeks. "It's gone," she murmured. "You did it. We all did." All around them, the Allied forces stared at the place where the great other had vanished. No swirling black shadows re-emerged. No fresh tentacles of ice rose from the pit. The monstrous deity was undone, its essence scoured away by the combined might of dragon flame, White Walker sorcery, and mortal resolve. The threat that had loomed since the dawn of days was no more. A final hush descended. The Night King stepped forward, gliding across cracked ice. He surveyed the battered battlefield, with an inscrutable expression. Then, without a word, he bowed his head to Jon and Daenerys, perhaps in acknowledgement of the alliance, or perhaps in farewell. As one, the remaining White Walkers turned northward, gliding away across the ruinous valley, taking their surviving whites with them. The living parted for them in stunned silence. Where once there had been hatred and fear, now there was only a numb, exhausted acceptance that each side had done what was required to save the world. Jon tried to stand on his own, but Daenerys kept an arm around him, supporting his weight. Grey Worm and Tormund approached, their expressions a mix of awe and relief. Tyrion limped forward, leaning heavily on a broken spear shaft as a makeshift cane, tears shining in his eyes. Brienne and Jaime stood side by side, armor dented and scorched, gazing at the dissipating gloom. Bran, still in Podrick's care, blinked rapidly, as though surfacing from a deep trance. His voice, when it emerged, was soft. "The dawn will come again. The darkness was turned away here. We live to see tomorrow." "And oh." Men began to cheer, a ragged, disbelieving sound at first, then growing into a roar that echoed off the ice-laden cliffs. They flung their helmets in the air, clashed swords on shields, weeping and laughing in equal measure. They had witnessed the impossible, an unholy alliance that drove back a primordial god. In that moment, they scarcely knew whether to fear the White Walkers still, or to praise them as unexpected saviors alongside their own. Yet for now at least, the threat was ended. Daenerys pressed her forehead to Jon's, tears freezing on her cheeks. "We can rest," she whispered, though her voice trembled. "The great other is gone, and you're alive." Jon closed his eyes. "Alive," he echoed. Then, weaker, "Thanks to all of you." He sank into her embrace, letting the weight of exhaustion take him. Others began to crowd around. Arya, cradling her wounded arm, offering a shaky smile. Tormund exhaling in relief. Brienne bowing her head in respect. Tyrion approached, face pale. "You realize, my friends," Tyrion managed, voice quavering, "we've just changed everything. Who would have thought? Men and White Walkers fighting side by side." He released a strained laugh that bordered on hysteria. "And the realm has no idea what we've done." "It will," said Daenerys softly, gazing at the spot where the Night King had disappeared over the horizon. "Our world was saved by all of us. Living, dead, Targaryen, Stark, Lannister, even free folk. After this, we must strive for a peace that lasts, or risk squandering the chance we've bought with so much blood." "Ben?" Across the battlefield, men and women set about tending the wounded, searching for survivors, gathering the dead. The swirling clouds overhead began to part, revealing a thin band of pale light on the horizon. A timid sunrise that cast fragile warmth across the ravaged ice. In that light, the shattered wards glistened, but no longer did they serve as prisons for a malevolent god. The source of that ancient horror was vanquished. Jon let Daenerys and Arya help him walk. Each step was painful, but his heart felt an odd sense of lightness. The brand on his palm was still cold, a reminder that he would never again be quite the man he was. But he had found a way to use that power for good, and so had the White Walkers, if only for one battle. They had parted ways in peace, perhaps returning to their domain in the farthest north, content that their ancient duty was fulfilled. Nobody knew what the future held. The world had shifted, shaped by the day's extraordinary events. Perhaps the White Walkers would slumber again, or watch from afar. Perhaps men would still fear them. But for now, the great other was destroyed, and the living had survived. Daenerys guided Jon toward a makeshift field hospital set amid the broken wagons. Rhaegal circled overhead, crooning in sympathy. Ghost, battered and limping from earlier skirmishes, appeared through the snow and pressed his muzzle against Jon's hand. Arya knelt to stroke the direwolf's white fur, blinking back tears. "We'll take you home," Daenerys whispered to Jon. "To Winterfell. We'll all go home." He nodded, though he knew the road back would be long. Not just in miles, but in healing hearts, forging new alliances, rebuilding a realm battered by war and winter. Yet they would do it. Together. As the sun climbed higher, glimmers of rosy gold reflected on the snow, giving the valley a strangely serene glow in the aftermath of so much carnage. Soldiers, Northmen, Stormlanders, Knights of the Vale, Lannister men, Dothraki, unsullied, free folk. They began to gather near Daenerys and Jon, forming a loose ring. Some knelt, others stood with heads bowed, a hush settling over them all. Even from a distance, one could see the raw emotion in their faces: relief, wonder, grief for the fallen, and a glimmer of hope for tomorrow. Tyrion cleared his throat, stepping forward to speak in a voice that trembled with awe. The darkness was strong, but we stood stronger, united, as we never have before. May it be a lesson for all the days that follow. His words echoed in the fragile stillness. No one cheered. Instead, they merely listened, hearts too full for frivolity. Then, gently, as though cradling something precious, Daenerys and Arya lowered Jon onto a stretcher. He tried to protest that he could walk, but the pain in his ribs said otherwise. Grey worms signaled for the Unsullied to form a protective perimeter. Brienne and Jaime mustered the remaining knights. Tormund helped gather free folk who would assist in searching for survivors, or burying the dead who could not be saved. At the edge of the chasm, the swirling blackness had dissipated entirely. Only a silent gulf remained, a wound in the earth's crust. At any other time, it might have seemed sinister, but now it lay powerless, a mere hole in the ice leading to a cavern of extinguished evil. The ice overhead glimmered with sunshine that felt almost warm compared to the endless gloom before. Daenerys brushed Jon's hair back, pressing a kiss to his brow. "We'll leave this place as soon as the wounded can be moved," she promised him. "We'll go home." Jon squeezed her hand, feeling the faint spark of warmth returning to his body. "Yes," he murmured. "Home." Yet beneath his exhaustion, a question lingered. Would the White Walkers remain quiet watchers, forever changed by their stand alongside the living? Or was there another chapter left for them in the world's story? Jon could not say. But for now, they had shared a victory that transcended all lines, all grudges. For the first time, living and dead had chosen to save, rather than destroy. Perhaps that was enough. And so the battered host began its slow withdrawal from the valley, taking with them their injured, their dead, and the first fragile threads of a new future. The hush of the land remained, broken only by the sound of boots crunching through ice, horses snorting and the cold, distant horns sounding in weary unison. High above, Drogon and Rhaegal flew lazily, watchful guardians of a realm that had, at last, escaped a doom older than memory. In the end, Jon Snow closed his eyes to rest, lulled by the steady march of footsteps and the soft murmur of voices pledging that they would rebuild. They would remember, then they would strive for a peace worthy of the sacrifice they had made. And deep in the far north, the Night King retreated with his kin, a silent monarch leading his spectral host across the blank white horizon, carrying with them the memory of a day when ice and fire set aside their ancient hatred to keep the dawn alive. In that quiet departure, an unspoken promise lingered. If darkness ever rose again to threaten the living world, the Watchers in the far north and the mortal guardians of the realms of men might once more unite, strange allies beneath the boundless sky, to face whatever nightmares dared to stir from their ancient slumber. And for the moment, at least, that promise was enough to usher in the sunrise of a new age.